The wind whistled up the alley. A sign underneath a single light bulb that illuminated the side door read Commodore Hotel. Please shut it when you leave. The music was coming from the inside. It was Beatrice, Nebraska, 1922. Two men in overcoats and Bob's hats scrunched through the snowy alley to the door. They tried the knob, but it was locked. The larger of the two men drew a short crowbar. He pried at the door while he spoke. Watch out when you come out of here. Slip on that ice and you'll bust your hip just like my mother did. The smaller of the two men cocked his head. I thought you told me she went to step on a June bug and went through the banister rail on her porch and did a belly buster on the sidewalk. The lock broke and the door creaked open. The music was louder. It was coming from the sitting room of the front room of the hotel. They slipped inside the door. The faces of the two men were hidden by the shadow of their hat brims. The larger man answered. No, that was my Aunt Alba over at Mountain Home. I can't believe you can't remember any better than that. They unbuttoned their overcoats. The larger man took a Model 12 riot gun with a sawed-off stock off a cord around his shoulder. The smaller man had a .45 automatic out, and he fumbled in his pocket for a clip. They mounted the stairs. The old wood creaked, but the music from the sitting room covered it. The larger man said, I hope you remember to bring a magazine for that thing. The smaller man answered, Getting old's a terrible thing, but it's made worse by you. In the sitting room of the Commodore Hotel, the boarders were just finishing some pie and listening to a heavy woman at the piano as she finished the latest tune of the day. Tom Hammett, a heavy-set man nearing 60, looked tired, and there was no trace of the hard man that he once was. He wore a conductor's railroad uniform with a badge on it that said Hammond. He changed his name. He yawned and reached in his pocket for his watch. The song came to an end and the boarders clapped. Mighty nice, Louise, but it's time for my bed. Tom rose and started for the stairway that led to the corridor above in which his room was located. On the backstairs landing of the corridor, the two men stopped to listen. The smaller man went through a ritual. He took off his hat, pulled the patch off over his eye, put it in his pocket, and drew a pair of spectacles. He inserted the magazine in the .45 automatic and cocked it. The larger man inserted a shotgun shell in the magazine of the shotgun and cracked it shut. He pushed the door to the corridor open with a barrel. Getting even's a hard road to hoe, ain't it? Fourth room on the right. In the sitting room, Tom started up the stairs. The hotel clerk spoke to him. Good night, Tom. Tom turned. Good night, Bob. Tom was coming down the hall, fumbling with a large batch of keys. He reached his room door and inserted the key. He turned startled as the two men in overcoats stepped out into the dim hallway and came towards him. He could hear a new tune start in the sitting room. As the two men approached, Tom spoke to them. Say, you boys know Bob don't like folks using the back stairs in the wintertime. The two men approached with their weapons behind their back. They stopped just short of Tom. The larger man spoke. We're going to shut the door when we leave, Tom. Tom looked hard at them in the dim light. He leaned forward and his expression turned to fear. His voice pounded. My word, I ain't seen you since... The smaller man cut him off. Since 20 years, right on the mark, huh, Tom? Tom was jittery. Well, what brings you boys up here? I heard you was down in Cuba. The larger man said, We liked what you said so much in the newspapers, we wanted to come and look you up, Tom. Tom replied, Well, that's really nice of you. You ain't still mad, are you? I made my peace with Hess, you know. Cut the palaver, Tom. I hear you carry one of them British bulldogs. You got it on you? I don't carry it. I don't have no need for a gun anymore. The music drifted down the hallway. The smaller man put the .45 automatic under his blue moon bad eye, and he leaned towards Tom. Well, Tom, you're going up to meet Casey Jones in railroad heaven. You can get it in the back or you can face us. It don't matter to me, 'cause you're a liar. The small man drew the .45 automatic from underneath his dead eye and pointed it at Tom's head. Tom fell back against his bedroom door. How could you be so damn mean after what we all went through? The bigger man thought he heard a noise. He glanced towards the sitting room down the hall, then he turned back to Tom. Well, you know, storytelling's one of my favorites, Tom, but lying's the one sin I can't tolerate. This whole country's gone up in a bonfire of sneaky lawyers and politicians, and liars like you, and you're the world's worst, Tom. The smaller man with the moon eye leaned into the situation. When that Malinche devil had me by the throat down in the mechs, and I had the fever, the only thing that kept me going was seeing you up on the witness stand, lying like Grandma's hooked rug, Tom. We lost a lot of money, Tom. John lost a sight in his eye and a lot more. This ain't gonna be a fair fight. It's the end of the line. We never should have had to stand trial. Tom straightened himself up. He knew it was true. They'd come back, just like in his dream and just like they said they would. He straightened the lapels on his conductor's railroad uniform, looked the big man right in the eye and said, well, that's the way of it. I ain't gonna give you moon-eyed bastards any satisfaction. Tom took 2 steps to the right, turned his back on the 2 men, and started down the hallway towards the stairs to the sitting room. The last thing he heard was a little music. The 2 men fired. Plaster dust and gun smoke filled the hallway. The piano player looked up as Tom's head and shoulders crashed through the banister rails and he spat blood in the woman's face. There was chaos behind her in the sitting room as the 10 boarders moved for cover. Upstairs in the landing above, the small man said, that's the worst shooting I've ever done. Finish it, damn it. A shotgun blast cut his last word off. Tom's body jumped and the hotel manager, Bob, got specks of blood on his face and glasses. In the hallway above, the larger man turned to his friend and pushed him back down the hall. It's done. Go. Go. The doorway to the alley burst open and the 2 killers slid out onto the ice. The smaller man lost his balance and slipped. Ooh. The larger man shifted the shotgun to his right hand, put his hand out and helped the smaller man up. I told you, that's just how my mama did it. The smaller man was hurt. They limped away down the alley and their voices faded into the wind. This hurts worse than when the damn barbed wire on it. The alley was empty, only the sound of the bitter Nebraska wind. Slowly, the hotel manager appeared in the doorway under the single light bulb. There were specks of blood on his face and glasses. The wind ruffled his shirt and he shivered. And far away, he heard the train whistle blow. It all started 33 years before, in Cheyenne County in 1889. The doors of the courthouse burst open and Sheriff Calvin Hirshhorn entered, flanked by 5 other men, all rough-looking plainsmen in heavy coats. The sound of their spurs and boots filled the courthouse hall. Judge Daniker's office was at the far end of that hallway. A tiny bespectacled man, Abner, the judge's secretary, looked up as the sheriff opened the door to the judge's office and entered. Abner's expression turned to anger. Don't step on that carpet, Hirshhorn. Hirshhorn stopped short of the Chinese carpet. Abner continued. He didn't come all the way from China so a bunch of cowboys could wipe their dirty feet on it. Judge Daniker exited his inner office carrying a folder of legal paper. Calvin, step out in the hall. I don't want to hear about that carpet all day from Abner. They moved back into the hall. Just as the judge was about to speak, the door opened again, and a small man carrying a medical bag entered and came down the hall towards them. Get up here, Dr. Throckmorton. I want you to hear this. Abner, notated. Abner stayed in the office at his desk. Be it noted that on the 18th day of March, 1889, that Sheriff Calvin Hirschhorn, duly elected servant of this county and court, and 5 other duly sworn deputies. The judge paused. He looked over his glasses at Hirschhorn. They are sworn, aren't they, Cal? Yes, sir, they are. Are dispatched by due process of law to serve a notice in the form of a writ of ejectment on the person and property of Ezekiel Hammett, his place of abode being Section 10, Township 17, Cheyenne County, Kansas. Daniker handed the writs to Hirschhorn in a package. They all looked at each other. The judge inspected the sheriff and his deputies and then said, Boys, this is a thorny issue. For your own good, and I've discussed this with Calvin, don't take any chances. There are 2 higher courts in this land, the one at Topeka and the one in heaven. So keep that in mind. Dr. Throckmorton, I'll pay you from my own pocket to accompany the sheriff. The men shifted in their boots and looked at each other. Well, the deputies, the sheriff, the doctor, all turned and started back down the hallway. Daniker watched them go. He turned back into his office. He stopped on the Chinese carpet and spoke to Abner. You know, as you get to the end of your life, Abner, you start to see more and more that you don't really own anything. Ought to think about that next time someone goes to step on the carpet. The judge turned towards his inner office door. Abner spoke after. Inattention to detail fosters a careless and unchristian life, Judge. The judge shut the door behind him. He was pensive. He wondered if he'd done the right thing. Calvin Hirschhorn was a brave man, but eviction notices were tough to serve on Zeke Hammett. Out on the prairie, headed south out of St. Francis, the posse shook the earth, Hirschhorn in the lead and the doctor lagging behind in his buggy. Flip-flopping land prices, the gold standard, and the uncertainty of eastern beef markets had taken its toll on the Hammett Ranch operation. The yard was the remnants of a once great cattle operation in disrepair. Opal Hammett, a thin woman of 60 with an apron, was poised with a hatchet over the chopping block. A chicken was about to die. The hatchet fell. Specks of blood hit her in the face, and she held the plopping chicken at arm's length and stared out onto the prairie, detecting the approaching riders. Mrs. Hammett backed towards the house and onto the porch, still holding the plopping chicken. She called into the house for her husband. I think the Hess men are coming. You better get out here. The screen door opened, and the patriarch of the Hammett clan stepped onto the porch. He had on a white starched collar shirt and suspenders, a pair of gray striped pants. He was a picture of a tall gentleman of the day, 60 years old and 6 feet 2 inches tall. He raised the brass spyglass and searched the horizon for the approaching riders. Get the grandchildren, Opal. Take them to the storm cellar. I should go for Tom and Roy. There's a lot of them. No. They'll be watching over the 1016. It'll be all over by the time they get here. The thing to do is hold steady, woman, and do what I say. He motioned her away. She put the dead chicken down on the bench box and hurried around the corner of the house. Zeke raised the brass spyglass again and counted riders. He'd done it before when the Pawnee and the Comanche had come to his ranch to scald him out. They'd never succeeded. Zeke turned and went back into the house and went to his gun rack at the far end of the table. He took down a Spencer carbine and a box of cartridges. He took it to the window and opened it. He didn't like flying glass. He went back to the gun rack and took down an L.C. Smith shotgun. Opened up 2 different boxes of shells, loaded the right barrel with buckballs and the left with birdshot. He put 3 more shot shells in each pocket, the same load setup. At the corner of the barn, Burchard and Landis Hammett, Zeke's grandsons, were sharpening an axe at a grinding wheel by the barn woodpile. Come with me, Opal said. Hurry up. They were alarmed by her urgency. Out on the prairie, Hirschhorn held his arm up and slowed the posse to a trot. They were approaching the fenced property line. Back in the yard, the grandchildren scurried into the storm shelter with their grandmother. They shut the door and bolted it. Cracks of light came through the door. Bertrude said, "It's the Hesses, ain't it, Grandma? You're coming to take her home, just like in Mama's dream." Opal lit a lantern and got down a jar of berry preserves. "Hush. We'll have a little sweets. Grandpa knows how to deal with them." At the Hammett property line, Hirschhorn and his men had stopped. They were still mounted. The horses were tired. The men were tense. Boggs, his official deputy, sat to the right. Hirschhorn spoke. "All right, listen up. We're going through the gate. When we get through, you spread out 10 feet apart. We stop behind the corrals. You get off your horses and stay 10 feet apart. If anything starts, let the damn horses go. Nothing's worse than being kicked in the head by a horse, even taking a bullet." The doctor arrived in his buggy. "Mr. Throckmorton, I'm going to ask you to stay here where you'll be safe. You act in your own best interest if there's trouble. Open the gate, Jack." Inside the house, Zeke cocked his shotgun. He moved to the open window and looked out as the posse strung out behind the corral. Hirschhorn dismounted and took the legal papers out of his saddlebag, put on his gun belt, and checked his Colt for loads. "Jack, I don't want to go under serving papers for Eastern money. But if they shoot me, you order the men to fire and level that house." Boggs looked at Calvin. "God, Cal, you don't think Zeke could shoot you, do you?" "Well, he said he would. Just promise me." Boggs nodded. Hirschhorn looked at the dates on the legal papers. March 18th, 1889. He hoped it wouldn't be his last day on Earth. He started the long walk from the corrals, through the yard, to the door. A dust devil blew up around him and he had to grab his hat to hold it on. He knew that was a bad sign. He reached the porch, put a boot on the first step, took a deep breath, and moved to the front door. He looked down at the dead chicken on the bench box. The March wind ruffled his feathers. He knocked. He drew his pistol and stepped aside. He realized that the window to the right of him was open. He shouted inside. "Mr. Hammett?" "Sheriff Calvin Hirschhorn. I have some papers to deliver to you, sir." There was no answer. Hirschhorn braced himself, biting his lip. He could hear his own heartbeat. Boggs and the posse crouched with their rifles in hand, waiting. Then there was a voice from inside. "I know who you are, Calvin. My sister delivered you. I always liked your family." "Then open the door and take these court papers and sign them, sir." "Well, Calvin, you just leave them in the bench box and I'll peruse them when you're gone. Maybe wipe my arse with them." "I cannot do that, sir. I'm ordered by the court to serve these papers on your person and take possession of this property, for and behalf of the rightful owner." Zeke shouted back through the door. "I'm here by the Redeemment Act of 1864. You tell R.D. and Elmer Hess if they want my property to come and take it themselves. God bless Abraham Lincoln." A shotgun blast tore the transom off over Hirschhorn's head. He reeled off the porch and fell into the bushes, losing his pistol and the papers. The posse stood up and some of the horses bolted. Hirschhorn recovered his pistol, but not his composure. He watched the papers blow away in the yard. He got up and brushed himself off. "Hammett, can you hear me? You just assaulted an officer of the court." "I hear you, Calvin. What is it now? You want me to open the door with the yard full of Hess men? Ha! You're crazy." "There's no Hess men out here with me, damn you, Zeke. Open that door and take these papers and I'll forget this." He didn't mention to Zeke that the papers had blown towards the property line. The Supreme Court will decide this, Hammett answered. Hirschhorn answered back. Everybody knows there's no more lawyer money, Zeke. I'm doing what the court tells me. Hess is right and you know it. Cal Hirschhorn's words blew away on the March wind. Listen to me, Hirschhorn. By the Slave Protection Act, they only got 6 more days to get me off or their notices run down. So you take your court papers and stuff them where the sun don't shine. Or let's get to it. Your choice, Calvin. Funny how the law turns around blowing in a breeze like a bushy willow tree, ain't it? Hirschhorn looked around the yard. He brushed himself off again. He made a decision. He was going to pull out. And he didn't feel any shame about it either. He really didn't want to die serving Hess eviction notices. He looked around the yard. All right, Zeke. I'm going to pull out. Don't shoot me in the back. Calvin Hirschhorn had a taste like metal and oranges in his mouth as he turned around and started to walk back to his horse. He could hear Zeke shouting at him through the open window in the March wind. Hess will choke the whole county for water in the Wolf Creek. They'll dig up the ground and it'll blow away. Also, people in the East can go to the opera and eat cheap. It's true, Calvin, and you know it. Hirschhorn reached the posse, a greatly relieved man. Boggs handed him the reins to his horse. He threw the stirrup rigging up over the saddle and tightened the cinch. I'll not be shot serving Hess eviction notices. I ain't dying for no Eastern money, boys. Never wanted to be sheriff anyway. Jack, you nail those papers to the gate so we can prove we was here. We're going home. Boggs dismounted and nailed the eviction notice to the gate. The rest of the posse turned back toward St. Francis. Hirschhorn stayed on his horse for a moment. Boggs looked up at him. God, Cal, Elmer's going to be plenty mad about this. Hirschhorn looked down at Boggs. Well, then he ought to run for sheriff. Hirschhorn looked back into the yard. Zeke Hammett emerged onto the porch holding a rifle. The March wind blew up a lot of dust between them. Hirschhorn turned his horse back toward St. Francis with Boggs. He was glad to be alive. The Hammett clan hung on to its land through boom and bust, shaky land prices, and bad Kansas weather. It grew, but it didn't prosper much. Times changed. The century turned, and Congress declared the frontier closed, and big business came to Kansas. The small ranchman and farmer was in trouble at the bank and at the courthouse. And for every rat, there was a stale piece of cheese. It was May 1902. Politicians, business leaders, and newspaper men had been arriving at the Hess Hotel in Topeka since early afternoon. The hotel was the base of operations for R.D. Hess, president of the Great Chicago Cattle Company. He used it as a base of operations to extend his influence over Kansas land policy and business. R.D. was an exemplary, self-made man. He and his brother Elmer had served in the Grand Army of the Republic. After the war, they were able to obtain Army beef contracts and build a slaughterhouse operation in Chicago. R.D. saw the great eastern markets were expanding, and he began buying land in Kansas around 1885. He intended to raise Kansas beef and ship it to Chicago, where he set up distribution deals for his products in the eastern market. His influence extended well beyond Kansas and into Washington, D.C. He was supporting Governor Bill Balley in the coming November election. On this particular May evening, he was entertaining guests and was about to reveal the master plan for beginning business in western Kansas in earnest, where his brother Elmer had been acquiring land at auction and abandoned land in Cheyenne and Rawlins County since '85. The master plan involved a feeder operation to fatten beef up and ship it east. They needed water for irrigation to make the plan work. R.D. hoped to influence land and water policy through the election. Langford Hess was R.D.'s only son. Elmer had no children. He was educated in Eastern finishing schools and came to Kansas to take a degree in agriculture from the Kansas State University, from which he was to graduate in 3 days. Langford Hess was 22 years old and an exceptional man. He excelled in knowledge of agriculture and almost everything that he did. He was described as quick to grasp things and a born leader with no fear. Besides his formal education, his father had made sure that he split his summers between the Wolf Creek Ranch in Cheyenne County, where his family was unpopular, and the Chicago slaughterhouse operation, where he had come under the influence of a man named J.W. McDaniels. McDaniels had worked for the family off and on between stints in the Army. In 1880, at the age of 22, he had joined the 5th Cavalry and seen a considerable amount of action against the Indians in the latter part of the Indian Wars. In 1897, McDaniels quit the slaughterhouse for a 3-year stint with Colonel Teddy in the Spanish-American War. He served at San Juan Hill and came back a captain. He was referred to as Captain McDaniels. Langford himself had grown up virtually uninfluenced by women. The 4th member of the party that was to go to the Wolf Creek Ranch was John Tacker. He was mustered out of the Rough Riders in 1900 as a quartermaster. He had been hired immediately upon the advice of McDaniels to R.D. Hess. He had been in charge of the land buying operation. Tacker was small and fastidiously neat. He had all of the appointments of an accountant. But a strange rumor had persisted that he was a dangerous man. Only J.W. McDaniels knew what that meant. It was around 8:30. The sun had gone down. It was May 22nd, the night of the party. R.D. Hess would call a meeting in the grand dining room of the hotel to lay out his plan. Other businessmen like Mellon and Rockefeller were watching R.D.'s progress in Kansas. There was a large punch bowl in the center of the food table, and a group of reporters and admirers were milling around the table to get a look at the First Lady of Kansas, Marie Valley. She was tall, beautiful, and intelligent. Her husband was in Washington. R.D. introduced Marie to Langford. She noticed that his knuckles were bulged from being broken, and his grip was powerful. Langford occasionally enjoyed fisticuffs, a sport he'd never been beaten at. J.W. McDaniels was his teacher. McDaniels was due in on the evening Santa Fe from Chicago. He'd stopped in Kansas City to see his mother. She'd broken her hip the preceding winter by falling on the ice. Only Elmer Hess, R.D.'s brother, the old-time cowboy, who was asleep outside the hotel on a porch swing, knew that the stage was being set for an adventure that would have paled lesser men and made them bolt and run. The Hammett clan were the kings of the prairie. Elmer had 17 years' experience with them. They were tough. They'd survived Indians, boom, bust, and land grabbers, as they called the Hesses. Inside the hotel, Marie Valley complimented Langford on his coming graduation. He explained that he would have his degree sent to him. He would not attend the ceremony. He was due to leave the next morning, which was Sunday, at 7:30 a.m. At that time, he was to be put in charge of the Wolf Creek operation. His uncle was to stay with him for a week to 2 weeks to get things in order, and then he would retire to his home in Chicago. Inside the hotel, W.L. Cox of the Kansas City Star stepped up to Marie and Langford. He asked a question. "Excuse me, Mrs. Valley and Mr. Hess, but could I ask you a question, Mr. Hess?" Langford was cagey and political. "I think you'd rather talk to the First Lady. I know I would." Cox said, "I was until you came along." What I hear and what I want to ask you is that there are reports that Cheyenne County is on the verge of a range war, and your uncle created it by fencing off small parcels that he and Mr. Tacker bought at bankruptcy and auction sales. You'd have to ask my uncle that. As far as I know, there are only two major problems, Mr. Cox. The lack of education in regard to modern farming and ranching technique, and the poor land value market. But that's national in scope. You're a talker, kid. He ought to run for governor, Marie. Do you agree with that? Yes, I'm equally impressed with Mr. Hess. One more little thing there, Langford. I also get it through the grapevine that J.W. McDaniels is going with you to the Wolf Creek operation. Is he a rancher? Langford paused. He and Mr. Tacker both have Kansas ranch experience. They've both worked for my uncle the same way I have. Cox said, yes, but I remember them as something more than just cowboys. Langford said, excuse me, but I think my father's about to start the meeting. Mr. Cox, it was nice talking to you. Cox asked one more question as Langford walked away. What about the governor's business tour? Won't he be taking a chance going into an area that's on the verge of a war? Marie Valley took Cox by the arm. I hope that things can be resolved without any kind of violence or calling the National Guard in. I think that's the governor's purpose in going there, to quell things, diffuse the situation, so to speak. Cox looked back at her. But it's going to be a hot 4th of July, from what I hear. Oxy Johnson called the meeting. The presence of all was required in the ballroom to listen to R.D. Hess's plan. He raised his arms. The crowd was quiet. Gentlemen, the century has turned. Times have changed, and America is hungry for beef. The great markets of the East are expanding, with factories and businesses the like of which the world's never seen. New York alone eats 25,000 cows a day and 300,000 bushels of grain. Now how in the name of the Lord can the small farmer be going broke? He stopped. There was a murmur. 'Cause he didn't change. To supply the markets of this century, you're going to have to be big and you're going to have to be able to deliver. We see Kansas as a place that subscribes to that philosophy, and that's why we came here over 17 years ago, and my brother Elmer and I have invested over $1 million to date. There was a brief round of applause. The speech continued. It drifted out through the open windows of the hotel like an ill wind. The old-time cowboy Elmer Hess was asleep on the porch swing. He was far away, in a field of sunflowers, and it was full of ponies, all with Comanche markings on their rumps. Elmer smiled to himself as he leaned down and lit the lip on the trap. He was going to catch Little Dog, and then he was going to steal all his horses back. Little Dog called him Mr. Many Cows. Elmer awoke with a start as a $25 handmade boot started the porch swing. Wake up, foghorn. He opened his eyes and looked up at J.W. McDaniels. McDaniels had a fancy embroidered carpet bag in his right hand and a short, 3-foot smooth leather rifle case in his left. Shouldn't wake a man up like that. Hell, 25 years ago I would have killed you. J.W. didn't answer. He walked 2 feet to the hotel window and leaned the rifle case against the hotel wall. He set the carpet bag down. There's the woman, Elmer, the big tall gal. What do you think? You woke the dictionary up, J.W.? Probably Bill Valley's wife. Wife of the fellow R.D.'s supporting for governor. He's going for a second term. God, he's a moron if God ever put one on the earth, but she's real smart. I think she really runs things. Well, Elmer, I'm going to have to call you Grandpa. J.W. turned back towards Elmer, pulled a Cuban cigar out of his lapel, and lit it, and handed it to the old cowboy. Try it, Elmer. It's Cuban. Best there is. Oh,
Sit down here beside me. I want to talk to you. I ain't getting around as good as I used to, you know.
J.W. sat down on the porch swing and they smoked at the cigar while Elmer talked.
Now listen to me. R.D. can connect up the Rockefeller rail out of Colorado and run it across the middle of St. Louis for all I care. Hell, he can run it under the Atlantic to Paris, France if he wants to. But there won't be nothing on it but a stack of Kansas cow shit. 'Cause we ain't got enough water to irrigate the land to raise the winter feed for the year-round operation. Can't raise what he claims we need with the water we got.
I thought that was the idea, connect up the Wolf with what's the name of that creek that runs through there?
The Elm. And it ain't gonna be as easy as you think. It's been a long time since we trailed Little Dog out to Pawnee Rock and shot him in the ass. The Hammets ain't an easy bunch. Dick Richardson and them border on the Elm, and we got to have it.
Well, we'll do the best we can, Elmer.
Well, that's gonna take more than scaring them to death, I'll tell you that.
J.W. puffed on the cigar. John inside?
Yeah, him and the kid both.
I think I'll just miss a business meeting and come in afterwards if it's all right with you. Elmer handed J.W. the cigar.
Oh, you ought to take that inside and blow smoke up their ass. You'd fit right in.
Well, that's a new way of doing business, Elmer. At least that's the way I understand it. Elmer got up off the porch swing. His knee buckled and he lurched against the porch rail. J.W. saw that he was an old man now and he felt sorry. Elmer disappeared down the hotel steps and off into the warm May night towards the carriage house where he was to sleep. J.W. reached in his pocket, got his watch out, and lit a match to ignite the face. It was 9:17 on May 22nd. He flipped the cigar away, and a mile away in the Kansas River bottom, he heard the train whistle blow on its way to Colby. It was May 23rd of 1902. It was a balmy Sunday morning in Atwood, Kansas, in central Cheyenne County. The population was in church listening to the Christian wisdom of the Reverend Ferris Peabody, a well-known populist sympathizer and sometimes spokesman for the unhappy protesters against land policy in the county. Two rough-looking cowboys in well-worn outfits smoked a handmaid between the two family carriages of the Hammets. They were Burchard Hammett, Zeke's grandson, and Peck Lloyd, a favored cousin. Peck was a good hand with horses and wore a new 5.5-inch barrel Colt that he'd just gotten from the J.T. Marker Mail Order Company. Peck flipped the smoke away as the service ended and the doors came open. Zeke Hammett filed out with Opal on the arm of Tom. He shook hands with the Reverend, and Opal and he started towards the buggies. Zeke was 73 years old and held his Bible like it was gold. It had been 13 years since he'd run Sheriff Calvin Hirschhorn off his land for trying to serve a Hess eviction notice. His wife Opal was thinner than ever and held onto the arm of Tom, their second son. Tom was known in the county as a tough fist fighter and a better-than-fair hand with a 4-pound Remington that he kept under his buggy seat wrapped in an oilcloth. As Zeke neared the carriage with the rest of the Hammett clan that numbered almost 25, including women and children, Dick Richardson caught up with Zeke.
I ain't asking you, Zeke, I'm begging you. I told you before church I'm tapped out and cropped out. They'll come in and buy me out, and by God, that'll be the end of you, too. They'll take the elm, and then they'll have what they want.
Zeke scowled at Richardson for a moment. Then he swung up into the Arrow buggy with a Surrey top. He looked down at Richardson.
Shut up and stop sniveling, Dick. This ain't Philadelphia or Boston. You got to be a man out here. Now, I told you when the time come that I'd do something. Sunday's my family and Bible day, you know that. You come by tomorrow and we'll talk at noontime, have some of Mother's chicken. I'll see you then.
Richardson jumped out of the way as Zeke reined the buggy and the clan pulled out for the schoolyard on the west side of town, where it was their custom to meet on Sundays for a picnic, weather permitting. It was at these meetings that Zeke ran his family and the plans for the week's coming hard work involved in the ranching operation. They were hanging on by the skin on their teeth again. The party stopped at the schoolyard. The men set up a horseshoe game and the children played marbles and hide and seek. The women spread lunch out on the old wooden tables under the 60-foot elm tree. Their Sunday clothes were neat, but they were well worn and some of them were threadbare. Zeke stood at the center of the activity, reading his Bible to himself as the family played out around him. He finished chapter 13, his favorite. He looked up into the branches of the elm tree as if for a sign from God. The balmy prairie breeze rustled the big tree. Zeke slapped his Bible on his leg and called for the familiar family meeting.
Gather round. I ain't up to yelling.
The entire clan of adult men came to take their place on the ground around the tree. Roy was the oldest, 50. He had 3 sons, Burchard, Barkus, and Daniel. Daniel wasn't present for a reason. Tom's boys were Ramsey Joe and Landis. Peck Lloyd, the cousin, was a son of Zeke's sister, now deceased. They all sat on the ground.
Me and Opal are old. We're not set for too much more earthly life, but we worked hard and done what the Lord's asked. And there's been more than some benefits, as you all know. Comes a time when you have to face up. The market's dropping again. We've only escaped disaster by the hair on our chinny chin chin. I got no more to lend or borrow, and Opal and me are old, and I'm losing my sight, boys. I've held steady through storm and bust. It's time for y'all to grow up and take hold, and personally I hope it's going to be nobler than what I've been hearing and seeing.
Roy shifted on the ground. I got something to say about that, Daddy. Zeke pointed at Roy with the Bible.
Don't interrupt your father, Roy. I've heard the stories the Hesses are closing in on the county. Educated ranchers from the city bringing money in by the boxcar load and equipment too. Start something called a feeder operation, as Elmer Hess says. Well, Elmer brought out Berniker and he's sure to take Dick Richardson's place next. That just leaves me between them and the Elm Creek in the road. We don't want them to connect up with a wolf, so we're going to have to take what I'm calling emergency action.
Tom spoke up. They know we're down, Dad. It's just those penguin-suited land-grabbing bastards from Topeka.
You have been listening to Kansas Bad, adapted from the original book and screenplay by Marc Miles.
Zeke pointed the Bible at Tom.
I see where the boy's behavior and language comes from, Tom. This is a Sabbath and those are ladies.
He pointed at the women and they all looked his way.
If you keep your mouth shut, I'll tell you what's what. There's only one thing that a man can do to save himself.
The clan looked up. He held the familiar Bible into the air.
It's all right here in the Bible.
The whole group looked disgusted but captive. Zeke flipped through the pages to chapter 13. The prairie wind rustled his gray beard and hair as he began to quote scripture.
Moses sent his son to spy in the land of Canaan, and what did he find?
Peck Lloyd leaned towards Ramsey Joe and suggested a harem girl. His grandfather didn't hear. Ramsey Joe made an obscene gesture behind his grandpa's back.
What he found was a strong and fortified country, and he come home empty-handed. And that's the way we're going to send R.D. Hess's son back home to him empty-handed.
We're over his saddle, Dad, Tom spoke up. Zeke whirled and turned to Tom and pointed the Bible at him.
Hush up, Tom. You've always had a hot head and cold feet. You're all going to follow my commands, and there's only one thing on God's earth a man can do to save himself from people that tries to live life the easy way like R.D. and Elmer Hess. And it's 2 words, and it's hard work. Roy, we're going to round up everything on you in Gracie's section, and we're going to sell it.
Roy shifted on the ground again. He looked surprised. Well, that's crazy, Daddy. The market's sinking. We'd lose maybe $1,500, maybe more. I'd lose the place sure for next year. The wind rustled Zeke's hair again. He looked up into the tree.
It is a disappointment for a man to put his very life to the test and see the fruit of his loins be such a bunch of pea-brains. It ain't your place, it's mine. Just like everything else this family has. On your section, Roy. Richardson's going under. On my quarter of the 1017. They could take us all down if things get worse. We're going to get solvent, you get it?
Roy said, Well, where are me and Gracie and Daniel going to live, Dad? Daniel was the one member of the family that wasn't present. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 290 pounds. He had an embarrassing habit when he was taken with the family to church of speaking up while the Reverend Peabody was giving his sermon and telling the entire church about his experience when he saw Jesus while plowing a field. He was slow, but they called him a special child. He liked to polish harness and watch his mules. They left him at home. Zeke answered the question.
In our house where you is all born, all of you. And we start tomorrow morning at 5:30. That's all I got to say. Let's eat our dinner and thank the Lord for what we have. Because you boys are going to have to learn to grab a root and growl.
Zeke turned away from the party, and they all approached the table and ate their dinner. The spring wind carried the sound of a train whistle from far away. Peck Lloyd looked down the table to Ramsey Joe, and they smiled at each other. It was 7:16 of that same Sunday evening. The train let off steam in the Colby yard. Elmer Hess, Langford, and J.W. stepped off the train, followed by John Tacker, limping along carrying a heavy leather case that contained the Wolf Creek Ranch accounting records. Peck Lloyd and Ramsey Joe were seated at the end of the platform on a bench. As the Hess group came toward them, J.W. was carrying his carpet bag in the heavy rifle case. He turned to Elmer. You know those boys, Elmer?
Oh, it's Ramsey Joe Hammond. The other one's a cousin or bastard son or something.
J.W. stopped in front of the 2 young men and looked down at Peck's gun belt.
Do I know you?
Peck Lloyd looked up. He didn't look afraid. Not that I can recollect. What's your name, mister? J.W. picked up some antagonism in Peck's voice.
You got things turned around here. I asked you if I knew you, and here I am having to tell a stranger my name. Reason I asked in the first place was 'cause I see you tie your gun down. Thought I might have seen your picture in the Western Gunfighter section of the newspaper, but I guess it wasn't you, was it? No, it wasn't me, mister. J.W. changed his tune. Well, I've made mistakes before, boys. You live around here? We're your new neighbors. J.W. introduced John and Langford. He knew very well that they already knew each other. Langford reached out to shake Peck's hand, but Peck refused. Glenn Thurber, the Wolf Creek Ranch foreman, drove a four-place buggy with a horse tied behind it up to the platform. The Hess men proceeded to the buggy and put their luggage in the well behind the second set of seats. J.W. opened the snap on the rifle case and drew the rifle out in two pieces. He fitted it together and snapped the forearm on. He untied the horse, and as the buggy pulled away, he mounted the horse and turned back towards the Hammets for a parting shot. The Hammets stood on the platform and watched J.W. come towards them. He rested the huge rifle on his thigh. As he approached the platform, he drew two Cuban cigars out of the lapel of his suit jacket. You boys ever smoke Cuban cigars? They're darn good. Here. He tossed each man a cigar. Peck let his drop onto the platform. Them are Cuban, boys. The best there is. Peck looked at the double rifle. What is that, mister? Is that a shotgun or a rifle? J.W. looked pleased. I'm glad you asked that. It's a Rigby, made over in London, England. Shoots a .455 Ely designed to bring down Cape buffalo. The Hammets looked at each other. Peck spoke. Ain't been no buffalo here since before I was born, mister. Oh, I know that, boys. If I was going to hunt buffalo, well, I'd take a steamer up the Mississippi, up into the Shankin. That's where they all are. Them big 2,000-pounders are still hanging around up in Canada, I've heard. Peck and Ramsey looked at each other again. Well, if you ain't planning to hunt buffalo, what are you going to do with it, mister? Oh, I'm glad you asked that, too. My employer, Mr. Hess, tells me that there's a lot of wild jackasses in this country. Ramsey Joe spoke up. I ain't never seen any of you, Peck. No, I ain't. Well, if you do, let me know, 'cause that's what I'm after. J.W. bid the Hammets goodbye by saying, Have a good life, boys. He spurred the horse and followed the carriage towards the Wolf Creek Ranch. Peck picked the cigar up off the platform and stepped down into the road. He watched J.W. ride away. He broke the cigar and threw it into the dirt. Turned back to Ramsey Joe. That man can kiss my ass. It was 10:15 at the Wolf Creek Ranch. The Hess Riders had finished a light dinner prepared by Mrs. Crow, the 70-year-old cook. She was cleaning the table off. Prior to this, they'd had a short meeting with what they now called department heads. John Tacker had explained to the men on the ranch what they called the new business policy, and he had begun to institute some changes. Tacker was speaking. I believe that the organizational meeting went about as expected. A lot of skeptics, but that's natural when things change. Elmer spoke up. Well, it's all yours after today, boys. I'm going to hang around and be an advisor till after the 4th of July. And I might go to Europe and live in style before I meet the big scary. Langford spoke up. Well, I'd feel better the longer you stay, the more we learn, Uncle Elmer. I think you and John should spend at least 3 or 4 days on the acquisition maps and meet with a banker. What's his name? Turpentine? Langford got a kick out of that name. Elmer corrected him. Turntine, Langford. You ought to get it right. John decided he would take the liberty to retire. Langford did the same. Elmer and J.W. sat at the table. Let's go out on the porch a minute before we turn in, J.W. I'd like to smoke one of them fancy cigars. Elmer moved through the door and out onto the porch. J.W. went to his carpet bag to get his supply of Cuban cigars. Elmer looked up into the sky. It was dark, but the stars twinkled. Elmer had never come down on the Hammets for the insults and the lost money due to the refusal to surrender property for a very good reason. It had nothing to do with being afraid of a confrontation. It involved common sense. On the prairie, clans stuck together, and if you couldn't finish the whole thing at one time, there were friends, relatives, and tribes to be reckoned with. Rifle technology had steadily improved, and it was difficult to detect an ambush that could come from as far away as a half a mile. After all, no one wanted to crawl on his belly across Kansas. Elmer knew what McDaniels was capable of, and even though John Tacker had been working with him for 2 years, he knew very little about him, but he took McDaniels' word for it that when it came to it, Tacker was the man they wanted. Elmer had also requested that J.W. contact an old crony, Sergeant Texas Bob Sardu. J.W. came out onto the porch, and Elmer took the opportunity to lobby his grudge. J.W. lit the cigar as Elmer spoke. I was the hottest stepping corporal in the Illinois 8th when Sherman burned Atlanta, J.W. And you could smell it 20 miles away, just like you could smell the Hammets today. Old Zeke's cooking something up. I don't know what it is, but I just want you boys to be ready. Well, my job's to scare 'em. That's what you and R.D. hired me for. Past that, I don't know what it can come to. Well, it's the niggling little things that irritate you. I didn't mind it when I lost $800 because I let old Zeke get away with that land redemption law or whatever it is that left him on his place. I done that out of respect to get along. I figured we could afford it. But last summer they limed the railroad tanks. We lost about 30 head and it ruined the water for over a year. Just coming back now. I planted cane on Dick Richardson's place, made her stock sick, had to put in 1.5 miles of fence to keep him out. I figure they shot 20 to 25 head of stock, and you can't even go to town. The boys have to take 5 or 6 men at a time. It's just that they set the county against us and we ain't done nothing illegal. I've been operating by the strict letter of the law, you know that. Yeah, I do. What about Sardu? Did you get in contact with him? Yeah, I did. He's sunning himself down in Tascosa. I expect him pretty quick, maybe the next couple of days. Well, that's a good thing. He's a good man. Yeah, old Bob's all right. They smoked the rest of the cigar and turned in. Earlier that same evening, just after sunset, Zeke Hammett had stepped into his yard. His windmill creaked in the light evening breeze. He thought about the plan that he'd been working on all day. It was a plan to survive what he knew was inevitable. If Richardson had not failed, things would be different. The Elm Creek formed the border between Zeke and Dick Richardson ranches. They'd cooperated for 12 years. Now it was sure that the Hess Riders would purchase the Richardson place at auction on the coming Friday. That would give the Hess the rights to use the Elm Creek. The Wolf Creek came through the back half of Roy's section and crossed Zeke diagonally and ran along the road. It connected with the Elm Creek on his southwest quarter next to Richardson. He would sell Roy's stock
sell Roy's front quarter to pay off all the mortgages, and be free and clear and still have a little capital and control of the water. He was going to see banker Turntine the next day, as soon as he got the roundup on Roy's place underway. It had also occurred to him that this business strategy might force the Hess Riders on west towards the Rawlins County line with their desire for water for their feeder operation. It was Thursday morning, the day before the Friday auction. J.W. stepped out onto the porch and pulled his suspenders up. A rider was coming down the road. It was Bud Grode, a young ranch cowboy. He stopped breathless in front of the porch. "Mr. McDaniels, I brung you this. There's a fellow up by the line road says he wants to see you. Sent this letter down, said give it to you." J.W. took the letter from Bud's hand and looked at it. It was his own handwriting. "Bud, ride back up there and tell him he's welcome to come on down." J.W. went back into the house, poured himself some coffee, and went back onto the porch and sat down on the swing. Elmer came out and stood beside him as Bob Sardu rode in leading his spare horse. Sardu's history was a long one of waiting between wars. He'd served with J.W. and Elmer in the Indian Wars, and again in the Spanish-American campaign with J.W. and John Tacker. He'd won a long-range rifle contest in Denver, out shooting Tom Horn and Ad Topperwein, Winchester's factory shooter. Winchester had awarded Sardu a long .45-90 rifle. It had his name engraved on it and had a fancy checkered walnut stock. It rested in a leather case on the side of his spare horse. A shooting fork was strapped to the case. Bob was tall and skinny. He wore tight leather Texas-style chaps and a gray dirty duster. He had a military campaign hat with a chin strap. On the chin strap were two owl eyes of the green goggles that he occasionally wore. He stopped in front of the porch. J.W. greeted him. "Well, it's the Cannibal King himself." Bob didn't reply. He reached into his duster and pulled a fancy beaded Indian bag. He reached in for some cigarette rollings. Elmer spoke. "Hello, Bob." "Hello yourself, Elmer. I ain't seen you since the fight at the Cattails over by Bennington. Got a piece of news for you, too. Kind of late coming. Little dog died out at Fort Union. Said he choked on a piece of army beef." Elmer looked a little sorry. "Well, I always hated him anyway. He's the best horse thief I ever saw." "Yeah, I guess that's true." Sardu couldn't smile because he had a scar from childhood that cut his lip on the left. It gave him a perpetual frown. Langford opened the screen door and came onto the porch. J.W. turned to him. "Langford, this is a friend of ours, Texas Bob Sardu." Langford walked down the porch steps and put his hand out to Bob, who was still mounted. "Heard many a story about you, Mr. Sardu. Even hear you eat human flesh." He reached his hand up. Bob didn't shake. "But as long as all the management's here, I'd like to know what my deal is before I get down. If you don't hire me, Mr. Hess, you owe me $100 for the ride. If you do favor to hire me, then understand that I don't cowboy. I won't sleep with them and I won't eat with them. I'll put a cot in your barn and I'll be out of the way." Langford answered. "You make your deal with Captain McDaniels. Nothing in writing. I'd like to spend all morning talking to you, Bob, but I've got work to do." Langford turned and walked toward the barn. J.W. came down into the yard. Bob got off his horse. $22 a week, Bob, and $500 a head if it comes to it. You keep John and I safe. Watch Elmer, too. I'll watch the kid. You ride the trees and I ride the road.
Sardu looked at him. Well, that's a hell of a deal, Captain, as long as you stick by your friends. But with what happened to Horn and Jack Ketchum, I don't want to be getting into nothing that might be illegal. You're going to promise me that, aren't you? Me and John will never let a friend down, Bob. The auctions are on Friday. You stick close to John and make sure nothing happens to him, and no drinking, because I don't want to listen to him preach about temperance. You look after him, I'll watch the kid. That's the deal. Bob nodded. I'll put my stuff up. You better show me where. It took the Hammonds 3 days to gather the stock on Roy's section and move it to the sale barn in Colby. On Monday night, Zeke had struck a deal with Turntime. He would let the bank have a quarter section of the land that Roy farmed and ranched in order to wipe out his debt on his own home place. He left the bank owing no money other than $54 on a new Aeromotor windmill that he'd bought a year before. Zeke stopped at Roy's place on the way home and explained the deal to him. Roy was upset. So was Gracie. Zeke left and headed home. As soon as he was gone, Roy saddled a pony and rode towards Tom's third section to the west. Daniel, Roy's slow son, had been helping Tom mend some harness. Roy entered the barn. He was carrying a newspaper with him. Tom put the sail needle down and looked up. Roy said, "I got to talk to you." Tom answered, "Well, talk." Roy handed the newspaper to Tom. He pointed at an article. Tom read for a minute. Daniel came over and looked over his uncle's shoulder. He constantly combed his long hair the wrong way with his huge hand. Tom chuckled and looked up. "Oh, that'll never work. Never in a million years, Roy. You try to have Daddy committed like this old lady, and why, he'll wave the Bible at him and they'll cart you away in a cage. You'll end up in the larned nut house instead of him. You got a better idea, Tom. We've worked all our lives. He owns it all. We don't even own our boots, and we got no say in anything." Tom looked up at Roy. "Well, first off, Roy, Richardson's place will go up for auction day after tomorrow. I sent Barkis up to Colorado to get some whiskey and bring it back and give it to Richardson. You know how hot-headed he is. We'll see which side of the comb he comes out on. I don't think people are going to just allow the Hesses to gobble everything up. If they do, I guess we'll have to get in their way a little more. If we can force them out to the west to Rollins, we'd be rid of them." Daniel was looking up into the rafters of the barn. He saw an owl. He liked owls because they went hoo. Daniel looked up, and he went, "Hoo, hoo." Tom stood up and looked at both the other two men. He said 2 words, "Turley Wilbert." It was June 1st, 1902, a Friday. St. Francis, Kansas, in front of the county courthouse. It was auction day. The gavel fell. "Sold of the Oak Creek Ranch operation, the Southwest, 1/4 section of Section 11, Township 17, Range 4. Step forward and get your paperwork from the deputy." John Tacker stepped forward to review the papers and write his check. The crowd was testy. They pushed at him a little. Bob Sardu stood on the edge of the crowd holding the horses. He reached underneath his duster. A block away at the St. Francis Hotel, Langford and J.W. were just finishing lunch. "There's jelly here." The Reverend Ferris Peabody was seated across from them. He'd made a special trip from Atwood to confront them. His parishioners had complained that the Hesses had fenced off section roads, forcing the small farmers to travel further to get supplies. J.W. was just buttering some toast and putting some jelly on it. Have some of this berry jelly, Reverend. It'll make your cheeks pink. No, thank you, Mr. McDaniels. I hope you understand why I'm calling these situations to yourself and Mr. Hess's attention. Langford spoke. Excuse me, sir. I'm going to have to leave you and the captain. I'm expecting some bulls on the 4 o'clock flyer in Colby, and I need to start right away to receive them. Langford pulled his chair out and got up. The Reverend looked irritated. Nobody's a bigger fancier of beef on the hoof than that boy, Reverend. J.W. leaned towards the Reverend. Now I can see your point, and I can see what it is, but you should bear in mind that our company and stockholders operate by the strict letter of the law. The Reverend Peabody scrunched his face up. I have never implied that there's anything illegal here, sir. What I am suggesting is that caution should be exercised by you and your stockholders, whom I know for a fact consist of the Hess family. That's not true, Reverend. Mr. Tucker and I also own a percentage of the Wolf Creek Ranch. R.D. and Elmer had agreed to 5% each for the men for their services. Sure you don't want some of this jelly, Reverend? The Reverend Peabody leaned across the table and in his most eloquent voice began to speak. The other 2 diners and the waiters paid attention. Apparently my plea has fallen on deaf ears, and you are making light of me, sir. I'm pointing out to you again that there is amoral and there is immoral. You do not, or are not taking an interest in my pleas because you cannot discern right from wrong. And for that defect in your characters, I must pity you. J.W. took a big bite of toast with a jelly and wiped his mouth. There was a commotion outside. It got closer to the hotel. J.W. tried to maintain his humorous point of view. Well, Reverend, you know I'm a graduate of Bible school myself. I married Hacksaw Tom to a little sea squaw named Dabba Two Crows. You know, Hacksaw Tom didn't have no friends and he was a mean old man, so I even had to supply the best man. J.W.'s story was interrupted as Bob Sardu helped John Tacker, bleeding at the forehead, through the door. J.W. threw his napkin down and stopped short, got up from the table. He moved to John and took his free arm. What happened, Bob? Hit him in the head with a rock, Captain, when he's leaving the sail. He's cut pretty bad. They helped John to the table. J.W. asked the Reverend Peabody to get up from his chair. He pushed him away. Sit down, John. J.W. handed John a glass of water and a napkin. Wash it out, John. Get a doctor. Come over here, waiter. J.W. dispatched a waiter for the doctor. Langford broke back through the door. What happened? I heard somebody hit John with a rock. Langford saw John at the table, bleeding at the forehead, holding the napkin against his eye. Langford went to it and removed the napkin and looked down. Pretty bad. We better get the doctor here right away. We've already took care of it, J.W. said. John groaned. J.W. turned to the Reverend. Well, Reverend, I guess you better go out there and talk to your fold and tell them things aren't working out quite the Christian way. John spoke up. So I'm cut bad, J.W. I'm going to have it so goddamn doctor to hurry. The Reverend exited. As he did, Bob Sardu followed him out the door and then came right back in. Farmer coming with a shotgun, J.W. There was a crowd in the street. Dick Richardson, who just lost his ranch, was drunk and armed with a single-barrel Sears shotgun. J.W. gave orders. Langford, you take John out back into the alley.
It's going to be hard on you, John, but let's move you now in case there's trouble. Langford helped John towards the back door of the hotel. J.W. turned back to Bob. I'll handle this, Bob. J.W. sat back down at the table in the same chair he was in. Richardson staggered in. He looked dirty and mean in his bib overalls, and he'd been drinking. J.W. was unarmed. He didn't need to be. He had Bob Sardu. Hey, ho there, farmer. You going hunting? I'll bet you're after that stuffed duck. He pointed to a duck mounted on the wall of the dining room to his right. Bob's hand went under his duster. Richardson looked around the room. He was a man about to do something. J.W. rose from his chair carefully, watching the farmer's hands clutching the shotgun. He approached him. What's your favorite kind of game, farmer? Richardson looked at him. I can't hear you. It looks like you're trying to say rabbits. J.W. took a sincere interest in the shotgun. That's one of them Sears shotguns, ain't it? Could I see it? Richardson stepped back out of reach, holding it across his chest. Bob was about 4 feet behind him. You know what my daddy used to say about rabbit hunters, farmer? No, I don't. J.W.'s demeanor changed. He turned mean and talked slow. Well, he always said that a rabbit's just a long-eared rat, and then that shoots them will all too soon be eating rats. You a good shot, farmer? Richardson knew he was in over his head. Yeah, well, I can hold my own, I guess. You got one. Richardson looked surprised. Got what? One of them ones that don't shoot straight. J.W. reached out and grabbed the gun from Richardson. He twisted it away from him wheel style. At the same instant, Dr. Throckmorton entered from the door behind. J.W. held his hand up to the farmer. Just a minute, farmer. Doctor, I'd back, and I'd appreciate it if you'd hurry. J.W. pushed Richardson out the door of the hotel and onto the front porch. There was a small crowd of about 12 people. J.W. looked down at the crowd. Folks, my name's J.W. McDaniels, and I'm your neighbor. I'm a business manager at the Wolf Creek Ranch. My hobby's fixing busted guns. J.W. put the shotgun on the hotel step and stood down on it with his full weight until the barrel bent. Then he held it up. Oh, look at this. See, it's defective. He opened the breech and removed the shell. He pushed it in Richardson's face. And these will tear your rabbits up. He gave the bent gun back to Richardson. J.W. spied a half pint in Richardson's overalls. He grabbed for it, steadying Richardson by his shoulders. And what is this? Friend, you're just an accident going to happen. He held the bottle up to the crowd. Look at this. Now, I don't want to preach to you, but you know I'm right. Everyone knows that firearms and alcohol do not mix. J.W. turned back to Richardson and he emptied the bottle onto the steps. Sir, you're a danger to this community. All of you listen up. This is an example you should heed, just like Reverend Peabody just told me. Respect your neighbor. J.W. leaned to Richardson. Don't you ever come around me with a gun, you skinny little bastard. J.W. pushed Richardson off the porch and into the crowd. The Reverend Peabody had suddenly appeared at the edge of it. He was there to receive a sobbing Richardson. The group sympathized with him as he limped away, crying. J.W. turned back to Bob. How'd that happen, Bob? Don't know, Captain. Quicker than a blink of the eye and faster than I could see. Looked to me like maybe one of them hammocks, the big one, Tom, or maybe his boy threw the rock. I wasn't sure. Happened too quick. All right, Bob. You take the kid and Elmer on to Colby. I'll stay here with John and get him sewed up. I'll get a room in the hotel. I want to see what these folks are thinking.
I get a real funny feeling that they're just stirring the pot against us every day. You want the buggy, Captain? No, we'll ride horses, just in case. Sardu gathered up Elmer and Langford, and they set out for Colby to receive the bulls. It took Dr. Throckmorton over an hour to sew John up. They used a hotel room that J.W. had rented. Around sundown, J.W. walked to the courthouse. He used the bell phone to communicate with R.D. Hess in Topeka. J.W. warned him that he felt that it would be unwise for R.D. to accompany the governor to Colby on the planned governor's business tour, which was to arrive there the 4th of July. R.D. did not give J.W. an answer, but informed him that he would talk with the governor right away about the situation. J.W. used Saturday and the first part of Sunday to gather information, swapping stories with locals who would talk with him. He had the distinct feeling that things were going badly. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, John was ready to return to the ranch, his head hurting. They walked their horses along the Wolf Creek Road on the way back to the ranch. Tacker was limp in the saddle. The doctor had given John some cannabis and he'd smoked it. He was talking like a magpie. Half his face was bandaged. Never go to the doctor, especially one that fixes on farmers. I bet my damn auto's gonna pull up and I'll look like a Chinaman when I'm done. I'd like to shoot the next farmer. J.W. pulled up short and signaled to John to be quiet. He looked into the field. Didn't we just buy this section Friday at Nat Richardson's? John looked at him. So? J.W. made a spyglass out of his fist and looked into the field. Them aren't our horses. That black and white pinto looks like the one that I seen at the railroad station when we come in, either Peck's or Ramsey Joe's. You may get your chance to shoot you, Farmer John. Give me that rifle out of the boot, will you? John reached down and handed J.W. a 92 saddle ring carbine. John dismounted his horse and took his jacket off. He opened up his saddlebags and pulled out a cotton sugar sack. It was lumpy. He poured the contents out onto his saddle. It was a leather harness that contained a shoulder rig for a 9mm bottleneck Mauser that he'd taken off a German observer in Cuba. He put the harness on and hitched it up and buckled it across his chest. It had 4 stripper clip pouches on the right side. On the left, the round wooden butt of the Mauser protruded out of the holster. The butt of the gun had a ring for a lanyard. It was 3 feet long, and John tied it to his belt. He put his jacket back on and mounted the horse. They proceeded down into the field toward the creek bottom. Ramsey Joe Hammett reached under the log with a Lone Star glove. He and Burchard were hand fishing the Wolf Creek. They had several 20-pound catfish on the bank. He looked up as J.W. emerged from the trees with a rifle across his lap. Hey, ho there, boys. Yeah, who's that? Ramsey said. Why, it's the new owner. You boys got some nice Rocky Mountain brook trout here. J.W. looked down and surveyed the ugly catfish. The 2 Hammets began to wade through the water towards him. Where do I know you boys from? You got permission to fish here? We always fish here, Ramsey said. Well, there always comes a day when good things start to dry up and disappear, boys. Birch was easing out of the creek. Their handguns were looped over the saddle horns on their horses. John Tacker rode out of the bushes and sat between Birch and the horses. Ramsey was knee-deep in water. John, you remember that old man Catfish Swede? Had a pole station up between Marysville and the Harrison Ranch? Certainly do.
That catfish had smeared over the outside of his shack and smelled like garbage. I ever tell you how he died? Ramsey Joe interrupted. He started to go to the water. We gotta go home for dinner, mister. J.W. leaned forward, grabbed his horse's ear, leveled the rifle at Ramsey, and fired. The water exploded at Ramsey's feet and he rolled backward into the creek. John wheeled his horse in a circle and drew his Mauser. Birch froze. I spent a lifetime collecting these stories, and nothing makes me madder than being interrupted, John said. Better listen up, boys, especially when you're trespassing. Ramsey Joe picked himself up out of the creek, taking his glove off. He was angry and afraid at the same time. J.W. levered the empty out of the rifle and continued as if nothing had happened. Well, anyhow, the old man hand-fished the colt all his life. Had an old Big Smith glove with his sewed chain on so when he drilled him he'd get a better grip. Some of them weighed 150 pounds, so they've been growing since dinosaur time. And that old man would ride him up and down the river like a bucking bronc. So what's the point, mister? Well, I'm getting to that. Howdy, boy. He got a hold of a 174-pounder one fall. Must have been about 88. Took him for a Nantucket sleigh ride right to the bottom of the Kansas River. J.W. began taking the rope off his saddle as he finished the story. What's the Nantucket sleigh ride, mister? Well, I'm just fixing to show you. John, come over here and take this rifle. Tucker came close and they exchanged the rifle. J.W. played out his rope loop and threw it over Ramsey Joe, roping him around the shoulders. Put that rope under your arms, boy. J.W. started off down the creek, pulling Ramsey Joe behind. He was spitting water and swearing. Back on the bank, John said to Birch, don't be moving around too much. I can't see too good. My head hurts. You're one of them boys that poisoned our railroad tanks, weren't you? No, sir, I don't know nothing about that. J.W. was dragging Ramsey down the creek, floating with himself. You're gonna be a Kansas sportsman, you gotta learn to take the good with the bad. That's what my old dad used to say, I said. On the bank, Tucker looked at the ugly catfish with his good eye. He pointed the rifle at Birch and then at the fish. You want to play hold with fish? I ain't never heard of that. What is it? Well, I'll show you. He picked the ugly old fish up over there. Birch just stood there. John waited. He moved the rifle in line with Birch's head. Pick it up, boy. The middle one. The high handle was calls a fish. Birch detected that John was serious. He moved cautiously forward and started to pick the fish up. By the tail, John said. Pick it up and hold it by the tail till 6 o'clock, straight up. Now I won't kill you, boy. Birch fumbled with the fish. It was almost impossible to hold by the tail. John took his pocket watch out and looked at it with his good eye. That's only about 5 minutes. I know you can do it. Keep a hold of that tail, boy. J.W. returned, dragging a sputtering Ramsey Joe up onto the bank. J.W. got off his horse and slipped on Ramsey Joe's back, squeezed the water out of him. He looked at Birch holding the fish and then at John. Hey, John, what's up? That fish hold, J.W. Birch was holding the fish and tears were running down his cheeks.
He was starting to slow. J.W. walked close to Bert. An early dated mountain man sportsman's game. I've played it many times myself. But I've never had to hold the food, kid. Don't let go. Tigers killed 11 men that I know of, and at least 2 in cold blood. J.W. looked at Ramsey, who was cursing and choking. John, give me your old Barlow now.
You have been listening to Kansas Bad, adapted from the original book and screenplay by Marc Miles.
John looked around in his pockets until he found the knife. He tossed it to J.W. J.W. knelt down, gutted one of the catfish, and held the guts out towards Ramsey Joe. Now comes a part that a sportsman likes the best. That is, where we eat what we catch. J.W. started over to Ramsey, grabbed him by the hair, and forced the catfish guts into his mouth and face. He sputtered. Oh, Granny, God bless her sweet old soul, used to say, waste not and want not. Ramsey fell back on the bank, the catfish guts on his face and in his mouth. He was spitting and choking. J.W. turned towards Birch. Don't drop that fish, boy. Like I told your friend here. If you're going to be a Kansas sportsman, you got to take the good with the bad. J.W. confronted Birch very close to his face. Birch was still hanging onto the fish. Tears were running down his face. Now you tell all your cousins and your uncles and what have you that my patients are getting real thin. I don't generally hold with mistreating boys and crying babies, but you're starting to cost John and me money. And I think Tom, or what's his name, instigated the rock throwing at John. John interrupted from behind. Boy, you tell Tom I got something for him if I ever see him on Wolf Creek land. J.W. returned to his horse, took the rifle from John, and they mounted up. They left the same way that they'd approached, up the bank and through the trees and back towards the road. Ramsey got up. He was sputtering and choking. Birch dropped the fish and fell back into the creek on his butt. He defecated in his pants, and he knew that he'd have to clean up before he went home. 300 miles away in Topeka, Oxy Johnson drove R.D. Hess's special Smith carriage up in front of the governor's mansion and stopped. Clarence Danforth, the governor's chief aide, came down the steps to meet R.D. The substance of the meeting was high politics for the governor and his group. They needed and had accepted R.D.'s political and financial backing, but they couldn't win without the farm vote. Any change in repossession or redemption laws was sure to be unpopular and would probably cost them the election. Backing Eastern or Chicago political interests would also be unpopular. The governor's plan, on the advice of his council, Danforth, Hakes, Curtis, and Holiday, was to avoid the issue. At the July 4th meeting in Colby during the governor's tour, they would promise the farmers to convene a grand jury to investigate allegations against the Hess Group and other big landowners for fencing access and the abuse of water rights. As soon as the election was over, they could do whatever they wanted to do. They posed an argument that calling out the National Guard or allowing for additional law enforcement to protect Hess interests in Cheyenne and Rawlins County would be political suicide. At the conclusion of the meeting, Hardy pushed his chair back, stubbed his cigar out, and made this comment to the governor. Well, Governor and gentlemen, I can see that there are political expediencies here, and I understand them. But the safety of my family and financial interests are at stake, and your refusal to recognize the fact that the law is not protecting us disturbs me greatly. If the Wolf Creek runs red with blood, then it'll be on your heads. Good evening, gentlemen. Hardy turned and left the governor's mansion, a disturbed man. The governor coughed in the cigar smoke that Hardy had left. I need some fresh air. The governor walked to the window and threw the sash open. When he did, a foul smell hit him in the face. He choked again. What's that? Clarence Danforth answered. Oh, that's the sugar beet factory, Governor. When the wind blows from the north, it makes that smell. God, I think people would get awfully angry about that. Clarence answered again. Well, that hasn't been the case elsewhere. After a while, people have just blamed it on the wind. The governor put the window back down and Marie went to his side. She took him by the arm. That's the smell of progress, dear. Holliday made a comment to Danforth. I hope we're not making a mistake, Clarence. Earlier that afternoon, Ramsey, Joe, and Burchard had cleaned themselves up and made their way home. They recounted the misadventure with the Hess Riders to Roy and Tom and the rest of the family. Life on the prairie had evolved its own culture and way of thinking, the same way that an Aboriginal tribe on a lost continent was found to function. Every day was a battle for survival, and the Hammets knew each facet of the farm and ranch operation that kept them alive. Only old Zeke and Roy knew about the Indian Wars and had actual experience with it, but the younger men were proud of this heritage. What they'd really inherited was a penchant for vengeance. They had come to believe that an eye for an eye was both biblical and right. They formulated an immediate plan to take action against the Hesses for the attack against Burchard and Ramsey Joe. Tom laid out a plan to retaliate. At the end of his presentation, he called for Barkus. Barkus, come here. Tom held up a sack with $30 in gold in it. Barkus, I want you to ride to Colorado. You find your cousin Turley. He lives 18 miles south of Cheyenne Wells. Ain't hard to find. His house is just on the top of a small rise. Just a shack and there's some cows around it. You get him and bring him back here. Tell him there's a sack of gold to match this. We want to talk to him. Roy spoke to Barkus. Don't come back, Barkus, if you don't bring him. We need to talk to him. All right, Daddy. I'll find him. Barkus left the house and headed for the equipment shed. He would need saddlebags and some supplies for the 2-day ride. As soon as Barkus was on his way to Colorado to find Turley Wilver, the rest of the Hammets saddled up. It was around 11 o'clock at night. They would ride to the Colby yards and the Hess bullpens next to the slaughterhouse. They arrived in Colby around 1:30 in the morning. Tom rode to the edge of the slaughterhouse and looked up at a sign illuminated by a small lantern. It read Great Chicago Cattle Company, Western Division, Wolf Creek Ranch. Tom got off his horse, took the lantern down, mounted back up, and rode 25 yards to the bullpens where the 4 Hess prize breeder bulls were installed. He put the lantern on the top rail of the fence so they could see. They raised their pistols and fired into the pens. 4 top breeder bulls went down in a hail of gunfire. The Hammonds disappeared into the night, unseen. By 7:30 the next morning, Glenn Thurber, who'd now been put in charge of the Colby slaughterhouse operation, arrived at the Wolf Creek Ranch with the news of the slaughter of the bulls. Langford was doctoring a spring foal that had split a hoof in a milking stall. Thurber explained the situation. "No, sir, Mr. Hess, no one saw a darn thing. Must have done it around 1:30, at least that's when I woke up. I thought I heard shots, but by the time I got there was nothing. Not even a cartridge case. Nothing." "All right, Glenn. You go saddle a fresh horse right over to 1117. You find Mr. Tacker and Mr. McDaniels. You tell them to meet me back here. I'm going to go get my uncle and Bob Sardu. I want to thoroughly discuss this before we do anything. My opinion right now is we ought to be able to go to Sheriff McPhee in Colby and get a warrant sworn out against those bastards. Get on top of it right now, Glenn." Thurber left the barn and headed for the corrals to saddle a fresh horse. Cheyenne Wells country in Colorado, flat and windswept. Curly Wilbert liked it that way. He could see 5 miles in any direction from his ramshackle cabin that had rifle slits cut on all 4 sides. Curly was a known gambler and bushwhacker in the old days. He was related to Zeke Hammett by Zeke's mother's second marriage. He raised a few cows and stole a few. On this particular evening, he was butchering a hog that he'd found wandering on the road. Stray with no brand, as he called it. He had on a pair of filthy red long handles, Wellington boots, and a butcher's apron spattered with blood. He walked to the door and pushed the door open with his butcher's saw to see the approaching rider. His free hand went over the door jamb to find a .41 short Derringer, his hideout gun. He'd taken it off a gambler in Phillipsburg. Someone else had killed him.
I see you, boy. What do you want?
"It's me, sir, Barkus Hammett. My Uncle Tom and my Dad Ross sent me here to see you. They need to talk to you, sir." Barkus held up the sack of gold.
Well, that's mighty white of 'em, boy. But I don't help no Bible thumpers. They ought to know that. I know what's going on down in Cheyenne County. I can't go down and talk to nobody unless there's 30 pieces of that Judas silver attached to it. You understand me? Now pack it up and get out of here. If you can't pay the toll, don't get down.
Barkus held the money sack up. "Well, I can, sir. Only, it ain't silver, it's gold." Turley came through the door and bid Barkus to get down. He took the money sack and turned the gold coins over in his filthy, hog-bud-stained hands.
All right, we'll talk, boy.
At the Wolf Creek Ranch, the Hess Riders held a business-like meeting in the dining room. They discussed fully for 2 hours the situation that confronted them. At the conclusion, they agreed to a 3-part plan. First, they would go to Colby and confront Sheriff McPhee, asking for a warrant against the Hammets. Secondly, Elmer would buy a railroad ticket to Topeka and discuss the matter with R.D. They all considered the situation to be deteriorating. Thirdly, J.W. would go to the hardware store in Colby and purchase company rifles to arm Wolf Creek employees. McPhee refused to issue a warrant and argued with John and Langford. Langford left the office, went to the railroad station, and informed his Uncle Elmer of the situation. Elmer had picked up a copy of the Colby Gazette with an incriminating editorial by Pennington, which he intended to show to R.D. as further evidence of the situation. Bob and Langford returned to the sheriff's office to wait for John, who continued to argue with the sheriff in regard to the investigation of the death of the bulls. McPhee got up from his desk. He was angry at Tucker.
I think you're way out of line, Tucker. I can't go out there and arrest them for shooting a moo cow with no evidence, no witnesses. You know that. Tucker spoke back to him. I don't think you get it, Sheriff. Our company operates by the strict letter of the law. And if you can't give us the same protection you're giving that bunch of busted sharecroppers, then it's going to be on your head. Do you understand? Yeah, I guess I do. Outside of the sheriff's office, Langford stood on the porch thinking. Bob Sardu stood at the hitching rail holding the horses. Langford came down the steps. Bob, I want you to go to the slaughterhouse and find Glenn Thurber. Tell him to hitch that lumber wagon up with a 6-hitch and meet me at the lumber yard. I'm going to build a bleeder dam on the Elm Creek and choke those bastards till hell won't have it. I can do that, sir. Where's J.W.? Well, he's at the hardware store buying them rifles you told him to get. Mr. Hess, it ain't none of my business, but only thing gold and silver standard ain't changed is the price of free advice. What's that, Bob? Mr. Hess, I wouldn't arm them cowboys. Cowboys are cowboys 'cause they ain't smart. They'll end up shooting you or me or the captain or something we don't want. Langford looked back at Bob. Thanks for the advice, Bob, but Captain McDaniels and I'll make that decision if it's all right with you. Yes, sir. Bob saluted, mounted his horse, and rode off down the street towards the slaughterhouse. John Tacker exited the sheriff's office. He too was hot under the collar. He and Langford stood together and watched Bob go towards the slaughterhouse. They heard the train whistle blow in the Colby yards as Elmer pulled out for Topeka. The quarter moon rose over the prairie. The Indians called it the smiling mouth that led to heaven. But the Indians and the buffalo were all gone, and now the men that hunted them were not too far behind. It was only logical that they would turn their guns on each other. After all, spoils was what it was all about in their mind. Elmer thought about the Hammets and the 17 years of insults, and it weighed heavily on his soul as the train rolled towards Topeka. It was 7:30 the next morning. Elmer sat across from R.D. in the Hess Hotel dining room. He'd brought along an article from Pennington's Colby Gazette. R.D. was reading it while he ate some lox. Elmer slept on the train, but he was very tired. R.D. finished the article. What is this, Elmer? Pennington's laying us with being land grabbers, and he's calling us the outlaw millionaires. Why, this is ridiculous. R.D. threw the paper onto the floor. Oxy Johnson hurried over and picked it up. The article had the intended effect. Elmer explained to R.D. that he felt the situation was out of control, and with no law to protect them, that the time had come to protect themselves. R.D. analyzed this, and they argued. R.D. had not been asleep at the throttle. He set out a plan that he believed was within the bounds of the law. They would use company funds to further put pressure on the farmers and ranchers by buying more outlying land. He would immediately transfer $20,000 to their Colby bank account and instructed Elmer to allow John to go directly to the bank and avoid auctions, and that they would set up their own repossession department headed by J.W. McDaniels. As the conversation drew to a close, R.D. admitted that Elmer's solution might be viable in the event that the governor did not recognize the problem in July. It was June 20th. The weather was starting to turn humid and hot. Roy had arrived at Tom's house around 7:30 in the morning. They had serious business to discuss. Daniel was starting to cause Roy and Gracie some serious problems. He couldn't control his bladder. He had a loose lip.
and the whole family feared that he might spill the beans. Roy had determined that he would be best served to send Daniel to the Larned Mental Institution. Daniel lived there until 1932, when he was struck by lightning while plowing the hospital garden. Tom lived in the original sod house that Zeke had built when he moved into the county in the early 1870s. Tom's wife had died from tetanus poisoning 3 years before. Tom had torn the old barn down and built a new annex for Lottie and Landis and the baby. He lived in the old part of the sod house with his daughter Ophelia. Ramsey, Joe, and Peck had established quarters in the new barn. Tom and Roy had pulled up chopping blocks in the front yard and were discussing the evolution of events as they saw two riders pulling in off the line road. One of them was leading a pack horse. It was Barkus and Turley Wilbur. The stock of a Creedmoor rifle protruded from a pack made from an old army cot. Turley and Barkus proceeded up the road to the house and stopped in front of what had once been a white picket fence. Barkus looked proud. Turley pulled the money sack from a dirty leather coat and held it up. "Better be more than this tied to the cat's tail this morning, or you'll be on the list, cousins. Roy, you look like a possum with his first big bite of dung." "But I ain't been too happy, that's for sure, Turley." Ophelia came to the door of the sod house. She had a sack with some sugar for the morning coffee in it. Lottie came to the door of the new annex holding the baby. Turley eyed the women. Tom spoke. "Landis, come on out here and take your uncle and your brother's horses. Turley, get down. I want to talk with you." "Before I do get down, cousin, I think there's something I ought to tell you. I didn't ride here with nothing on my mind. I figure whatever you boys want, there ought to be a piece of that Kansas beaver attached to it." Tom turned sullen. He got up off the stump and walked to the old white picket fence. "I got business with you, Turley. I don't hold with old men sticking their family. Now either talk business or take your ass back to Colorado, 'cause the only beaver you're gonna get's the one that lives down in the Wolf Creek. Understand?" Landis stepped forward to take his uncle's horse. There was a moment of indecision. "But I'd like to take my pleasure, the same as any other man, Tom. You don't ever hurt to ask." "Get down and talk business, or get out of here." Turley got off his horse, and they went into the house to discuss the situation. Beck Lloyd let the lace curtain in the Colby Hotel drop as he watched the Hess riders pass by on their way to the Colby yards to meet Elmer on his return from Topeka. Elmer disembarked from the train and walked down the platform, and the Hess riders stood together. "All right, here's the way of it. Now, John, you and I are going to Banker Turntine. RD's transferred $20,000 more into the bank. We're going to have a business meeting with the banker and buy everything that's connected to us, everything at auction and everything that's for sale. We're going to hold steady till after the 4th of July when the governor comes. RD says he's going to convince him to call out the guard, or at least get the situation under control to protect us. So the word is we're going to hold steady and be careful. I only agreed to that, 'cause if it don't work, he says we can do it our way." JW put a little tidbit in. "Well, this is a time to stick by your friends and your guns. Langford, you and I'll go back to the Wolf Creek. Bob, you stay here with John and Elmer." They turned and walked down the platform. Elmer and John and Bob headed for the bank, and JW and Langford returned to the ranch. A bull moose with a 6-foot rack stared down on the bank business from above Turntine's desk. John looked up at it and chuckled. I see you're a bull mooser there, Banker Turntine. Why, yes, I am, John. I guess you know Colonel Roosevelt, don't you? Yeah, I do. He made me walk up San Juan Hill. John got down to business. Turntine, I've always liked doing business with you because you and I can talk numbers. Now here's a proposition that I want to put forward to you. There's accounts and there's no counts. How many accounts have you got at the bank that's as big as the Wolf Creek Ranch? Turntine shuffled some papers on his desk. Why, none, except the railroad, John. What are you getting at? John liked these points in the negotiations. All right, Banker Turntine. Elmer and R.D. Hess have authorized me to pay you up to 4.5% over your cost. We're interested in buying anything that's tied to us or connected to us, or could be. You understand what I mean by that? Well, yes, I suppose I do, John. We'd like to buy direct from the bank rather than having to go to the auctions. You know what the political problems are with that. We'd like to avoid it and come directly to you. Well, you know, as I said before, I could get in trouble talking about my depositor's private business. We understand that, Banker Turntine. What we're looking for is business deals. If you're not the man, you're not the man. Well, hold it, John. I haven't said that I wouldn't do that. All right. Just in the immediate, we're interested in Raw Hammett's place. We understand that old Zeke turned it back to you. And Kittrick's place over by our railroad wells. Yes, that's true, he did. He owed his father on the note, and his father owed me. We'd like to drop by on Wednesdays, maybe starting today. Start settling these matters up. How would that be, Banker? Well, I suppose we could do business right now. Turntine got up and went to his files. He pulled the deed and mortgage records on Roy Hammett and Kittrick's place and brought them back to the desk. John and he began to figure the interest at 4.5% on the balance due to the bank. I get $1,364 on Kittrick. Is that right? Yes, that's right, John. $926.58 on Raw Hammett. Well, I get $60. All right. John reached in the leather case and wrote the checks. As he wrote the checks, Banker Turntine had a thought. John and Elma, you understand that the bank doesn't have a repossession department, so we can't really be responsible for getting you possession of the property. John finished writing the checks and slid them across the desk. Yeah, we understand that, Banker. Like any big corporation, we've got our own repossession department. Well, I suppose you do. Turntine took the checks, turned them face down on his desk. John thanked the banker, and Elmer and he got up and started to leave. The banker fingered the checks, and then he had one more thought. John and Elmer. Turntine got up from behind his desk and came across the room to the door. There's one more little thing. You mentioned prudent banking. Well, I have something you might be interested in. You know, Zeke Hammett's owed me for over 3 years on a narrow motor windmill that's in his yard. That wouldn't be something you're interested in, would it? John turned to Elmer, then back to the banker. Yeah. We got some poison water out by the railroad wells. We'd like to sink another hole out there. We could use that mill, couldn't we, Elmer? Elmer looked at Turntine. Yeah, we sure could. I'd like to have it right now. Let's get it settled up, John. John took Turntine by the arm. He took him to his files. Turntine pulled the records on the aeromotor windmill, and they sat at the desk and figured the interest for 3 years on the $54.10. John wrote the check and handed it to Turntine. The evening turned off cool. There were thunderheads and lightning in the west, and the sun was about to sink behind them. As John, Bob, and Elmer rode towards the Wolf Creek Bridge, they were happy and excited about the purchase of the mill and the Kittrick and Hammett property. John was talking as they approached the bridge. "Well, now you know your secrets ain't safe with the local banker. Turntine's a weasel, ain't he? You know, bankers have got a disease. You ever notice how they got the long noses and no chins? I call that bird beak." Bob pulled his horse up short and sniffed the air. He turned to John and Elmer, stopping them with a hand up. "Dove's passing the trees up there, John. Hold on just a minute." Elmer turned his head to slap at a mosquito. There was a loud blast from the tree line as Turley Wilbert fired the Creedmoor. The big 50 bullet whistled as it came in and struck Elmer's horse. It turned a quarter turn, knocking it out from under him, and it fell on his leg. "Oh, God!" Bob was off his horse. He drew an 8-inch knife and cut the camel straps that held his saddlebags on and threw them into the ditch. He took the reins, pulled the horse head around, and drew the Winchester from the boot and dived into the ditch in the slough grass after the saddlebags. John's horse had gone into a pitch. It had taken him 25 yards back down the road. Bob yelled at him, "Pull him down, John! Pull him down or shoot him!" John brought the horse under control and dismounted on the opposite side from where the gunfire had come from. He reached into his saddlebags for the cotton bag that held the Mauser. As he did, another shot from the Creedmoor came in and his saddle horn disappeared. Jesus! John also went to the ditch and began to crawl through the slough grass towards where Elmer was laying underneath the dead horse. He reached Elmer. He realized that he was hurt badly. The leg was underneath the horse and probably crushed. "Oh, God, John, I'll get you. Get it off of me." Bob yelled at John from the ditch. "Get that saddle gun, John. Use it to pry Elmer out. I'm going to try and get behind him. Cover me, but for God's sakes, don't shoot me." Bob began to crawl through the slough grass. He put his saddlebags over his shoulders and held the rifle between his elbows. He crawled down the ditch until he reached the Wolf Creek Bridge and dropped over the edge into the bottom. Another shot from the Creedmoor came in. It was obviously aimed at John's horse and had skipped off down the road. Bob opened the saddlebags. He took out a box of the long 45-90 cartridges and put about a half a dozen in his pocket. He levered the Winchester open and put one into the chamber and closed it. He drew a pair of elkskin moccasins from the saddlebags, took off his boots and put the moccasins on, and dropped off down into the creek. Up above on the road, John pried at the horse with a rifle to try and free Elmer's leg. Another bullet from the Creedmoor came in and smashed into the horse's belly. John opened the cotton sack, drew the Mauser out, checked it for a stripper clip, put it over the saddle, and fired at the tree line. The horse's shot missed Turley by 25 yards. John had no idea where he really was. He had put a cartridge belt on the railroad ties that Langford had left to build the bleeder dam. He reloaded the Creedmoor, took aim, and fired one more shot. He had killed John's horse. That was what he'd been paid $60 to do. He grabbed the cartridge belt and turned back towards his two horses. Bob trotted through the bushes and trees on the other side of the creek. He made a decision. He thought he would cross. He knew that the unseen gunman might see the rings of water coming out as he crossed, but on the other hand, it might be an advantage if he could get onto the high bank. Then he'd be above him. Bob crossed the creek. As Turley approached his horses, he looked down the creek and sure enough saw the rings of water. His old Indian fighter instincts told him he was in trouble. He backed up and put himself against a fair-sized elm tree, watching the creek and trees. Bob looked for the sure footing along the bank. He came to a place where there was a lesser incline and scrambled up it like a cat. He would now be above his prey. This was the part that Bob liked best, one-on-one. He went into a half crouch, the rifle ready, and walked along the bank. He could see Turley's horses now. They were nervous and pawing the ground in front of the creek. He walked about 30 more feet and then searched the trees for what he was looking for. And then he saw it. Half hidden behind a thorn bush down by the elm tree, he could see Turley's right hand on the forearm of the Creedmoor. Bob knelt, braced himself, drew the hammer on the Winchester back, holding the trigger down so that it would make no noise, brought it to his shoulder and fired. At the instant that he did, by luck or good fortune, Turley had decided to move his hand. The bullet whistled past him, crossed the creek, and dug a foot-deep hole in the opposite bank. Turley cackled at his good fortune as he dived behind the tree. Bob had already begun to move, but he didn't move to his left, he moved backwards. His hunter's brain went to work. He reasoned that if Turley's right hand was on the forearm of the Creedmoor, then he must be a left-hand shooter, and he would have to come out on Bob's right side of the tree. Bob changed his position a few feet. He stared into the creek bottom. Then he saw it. Turley's shoulder was just slightly visible as he moved to get himself into position in case he had to return fire. Bob levered the empty out of the big .45 90, brought it to his shoulder in one motion, and fired again. This time the bullet broke Turley's arm just above the elbow. He screamed like a shot bear, rolling in the leaves and bushes. He got up to his knees, dropped his rifle, and began to stagger towards his horses. Back on the bank, Bob knew that he'd been successful. He grinned one of his funny pulled-up grins. He laid the Winchester carefully in the grass and drew the Schofield and cracked it open to check it for loads. He dropped off the bank into the bushes and trees and moved about 25 yards to his left. Turley reached his horses. He reached out for the reins with his good arm, stumbled, led the horse to the water where he could get about a foot above it, and pulled himself up into the saddle. He cursed as he reined the horse across the creek and tried to start up the other bank. Bob emerged from the trees and bushes about 20 yards away, put one foot in the creek, put the Schofield across his arm, took careful aim, fired, and the bullet hit Turley just underneath the shoulder blades, and he tumbled backwards, falling down the creek bank and coming to rest just beside the water. He was lung shot. Bob turned and retreated to the cover of a cottonwood tree behind him about 10 feet. He knelt and waited. He could hear the old man wheezing. Bob reasoned that since he carried a hideout gun, surely this bushwhacker did too. He waited. A minute passed. He was fairly sure that Turley'd wheezed last. He emerged from behind the cottonwood tree and came to the creek. He waded across slowly, training the Schofield on Turley. "Don't move, old man, or you'll be deader than you are." He emerged from the creek and went and knelt by Turley, pointing the Schofield at his head. "You hear me, old man? If you can, you tell the Maker when you see him that you was shot dead by Texas Bob Sardu in a fair fight." Turley didn't answer. He was dead. Back up on the road, John had pried Elmer out from underneath the horse. "Oh, God, John, I'm hurt bad. I think the whole joint's crushed." "Hang on, Elmer." John remembered that he had some cannabis in his saddlebags that the doctor had given him when he cut his eye. He went to them, withdrew the cannabis, came back and began to roll Elmer a cigarette. "I'm not going to try and move you, Elmer. I'm going to the Wolf Creek and get a wagon. I'll dispatch somebody to get the doctor from Colby." Oh. Back in the creek bottom, Bob was going through Turley Wilbert's personal effects. He found a poster from a Garden City fair. It had some scribbled IOUs written on the back. He found a sack with $60 in gold, and as he reached under Turley's back, Underneath his belt, he found the hideout gun, the .41 short Derringer. Bob turned it over in his hand and grinned one of his funny grins. He pulled his 8-inch knife, knelt down, and sliced Turley's ear off. He washed it off in the water and put it in his beaded Indian bag. He drew some cigarette rollings out, rolled a smoke, and waited. In about 5 minutes, John made his way down the bank, leading Bob's horse. They talked to each other across the water. You ever seen him before, John? No, I haven't, Bob. Don't know who he is. Bob Elmer's hurt pretty bad. I think it's imperative that I leave now, go back to the Wolf Creek and get a wagon. Can I ride your horse? Yeah, you can, John, but just remember he don't like a hard bit in his mouth. If you put it to him, he's liable to throw you. All right. You better go back up on the road and build a fire, just in case. It's going to cool off. I don't want Elmer to get cold. Use my jacket to cover him up. We'll need to keep him warm. All right. What do you want me to do with the old man? Well, I'd look for a cow den along the bank. Stow him in that. Make sure it'll take him 3 or 4 days to dig him out. We'll get somebody to identify him. All right. John made his way up through the trees and up the bank. He waited until he reached the top of the bank before he mounted Bob's horse, and then he made for the Wolf Creek Ranch. It was 10:45 on the Wolf Creek Ranch. Tensions were high. Elmer had been loaded into the back of a wagon. On Dr. Throckmorton's advice, he would be taken to the Kansas City Medical Center. The best the doctor could do at the ranch house was to splint the leg. He felt that the joint was crushed and it would take expert medicine to save it. Langford put his hand on his uncle's forehead as he looked into the back of the wagon. He's got a hell of a fever, Doctor. Yes, I know, Langford. The only way to do it is to send him into the KC Med Center. I don't think I can do much more for him here. We'll pack some ice underneath his blankets. That'll keep him cool and keep the fever down. Hopefully keep him from going into shock. Bud Grote was to drive the wagon. The doctor looked up at Bud. Bud, here's some broth that Mrs. Crow made. I want you to try and get it down him all the way to Kansas City. You need to keep his strength up. Yes, sir. I can do that. J.W. came to the wagon and stood beside Langford. He looked down at his old friend. He reached down and took his hand. Elmer, if you can hear me, sure as the turn of the earth, this won't be forgot. I'm your friend, and I ain't never going to let you down. J.W. turned to Dr. Throckmorton. You sure he ain't in shock, Doctor? Yes, I am, Mr. McDaniels. This is the best I can do here. Just pack him in the ice and hope the train don't get delayed. A candle was passed, and the lanterns were lit for the 6 riders that were to accompany Elmer to the Colby Yards and the trip to Kansas City. J.W., John, and Langford stood in the yard and watched the lights go out of sight. And somehow they knew that they'd probably never see him again. When the lights were out of sight, J.W. turned to John and Langford. Well, there goes the last of the Wild West. Langford, what'd your dad have to say? He said to call him in the morning. He'd have instructions for us. Well, I hope he realizes what the situation is. Fellow Bob described sounds like old Turley Wolvert. He's an old bushwhacker. Shot Dick Patterson in the back over by Phillipsburg about 10 years ago. I think it's pretty damn clear now that they're out to skull us. John took his hat off. He fingered the brim. There's something you ought to know, J.W. What's that, John? Today when Elmer and I were at the bank, we bought Roy Hammett's place, but we got something else too. What's that? We bought the windmill in Zeke Hammett's front yard. All right, then let's talk plan. They mounted the ranch house steps and went into the dining room. There was an argument. Langford finally had to concede that J.W. would now be in charge. and that they were in a full-scale range war. He had promised his father that in the event of an emergency, he would follow McDaniel's orders, and he conceded to do so. McDaniel suggested a plan. "All right, John, you and Langford will go to Colby the night of the 3rd. That way you'll be there and be able to hear what RD's got to say and what the governor has to say. The Grange has got over 100 people meeting in Atwood. They'll be on their way there too. We'll take Roy Hammett's place on the morning of the 4th of July. Bob and I'll handle that. Secondly, I'd like to send a notice to Zeke Hammett that we're coming to take that mill on the 1st of August. That'll give things 30 days to cool off. That ain't written in stone, but it's the best I can do. I'll call RD in the morning and get it cleared with him." They shared a Cuban cigar and went to bed. At 8:30 the next morning, the bell phone rang. The news was bad. Elmer had been taken off the train at Salina. He had frozen to death. He was shipped home for burial in Chicago in the Illinois 8th graveyard. RD ordered an 8-foot marble angel carved, and it was erected as Elmer's grave marker, and it stands there to this day. Zeke and Roy returned from taking Daniel to the Larned Hospital. When they returned, there was a letter on July 1st waiting for them, informing them that the Hesses would come to take the mill in Zeke's yard on August 1st. Zeke and Roy called a meeting for the night of the 2nd. It was raining as the Hammett men entered the barn. Zeke was seated on a bale of hay with his Bible. He addressed his family. "Well, boys, I guess the times have changed. Now listen to me. The governor can't win without the farm vote, so Bennington says he can't afford to back R.D. Hess and the faster ejectment laws or calling the National Guard in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to pack it out of here at 3 o'clock tomorrow and go to Atwood for the Grange meeting. We'll have to camp out. The meeting's in the morning. And I want all of us to go to Colby. You boys are too old for me to control, so you're going to have to control yourselves. And the most I can expect from you is respect. They sent a notice on the mill. They're going to come and take it, and I don't want any trouble. Those days are all over for me. Like I said, the times changed, boys, and we got to change with them. That's all I got to say." Zeke got up off the bale of hay, went to the barn doors and opened them, and went out into the storm. The windmill creaked as he headed for the house. As soon as he was gone, Tom held up his hand to stop the other men from leaving. He reached in his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, walked to the bale of hay where his father had been sitting, and emptied the contents out onto the bale. The family gathered around and looked down at the grotesque object. Marcus reached out and poked it with his finger. "Well, it looks like a human ear, Uncle Tom." It was July 4th of 1902. Independence Day, and America was celebrating its birthday. Most of the county was in Colby, awaiting the arrival of the governor and to see what he would have to say about land policy. The question of the Hesses fencing line roads and using water for irrigation was sure to come up. It was 6:30. The sun had hit the line road a quarter of a mile from Roy Hammett's house. The steam vapor from the light rain the night before caused a heat mirage. Bob Sardu looked like a ghost. as he came through the rising vapor, as he neared J.W. and 5 other Hess riders waiting for his scouting report on Roy's place. He rode into the camp by a dead cottonwood and stopped. Bud Grote handed him a canteen. "Well, Bob?" "Just an old lady and a lame dog, Captain." J.W. turned to the Hess riders. "Thurber, you send your fastest horse back down the road for a lookout when we turn into Roy's. Rest of you listen up. I don't want any loaded cartridges underneath those hammers, so make sure that they're empty. I don't want any rough stuff, and least of all that old lady getting hurt. We're just going to show the deed, remove whatever's left from the house. Now be careful with it, because it's all they got left, and that's what they worked hard for all their lives. Anything goes wrong, you let me and Bob take the brunt. All right, let's go." The Hess riders mounted their horses and proceeded down the road through the rising steam vapor. Grace Hammett, Roy's wife, was nearly 50. She was well worn and tired. Grace was a little cracked with the loss of the place and all the trouble. She kept the Bible on a washstand near the stove where she was cooking breakfast. She became alert at a noise outside. The crippled dog went to the door and barked. She opened the door. J.W. was leaning on his saddle horn, relaxed, with the deed and the notices in his gloved hand. Grace stepped out into the yard. So did the dog, but he didn't bark. "Hey ho there, ma'am. Good morning. I'm J.W. McDaniels. I'm the business manager at the Wolf Creek Ranch. I got a clear title to this property, and I'm here to take possession. Would you like to examine the papers?" Grace came closer. "I don't know nothing about this. My husband said tomorrow. He's in Colby talking with the governor about land policy." "Really? Well, ma'am, I'm sorry about that. I've got to do my job today." "You could go there and find him." "Well, I really don't have time, ma'am. I'm on a tight turntable schedule. Corporation work, you know. We have to pack your things up and move them out for you. Brought these men along to help." J.W. got down off his horse and petted the dog. "Where was you planning to move my things to?" "Well, ma'am, just about right over there where old Bob's horse is standing. I'm on a tight schedule, and I brought these men to help. Please cooperate." "Well, you can't do that." Grace turned and went back into the cabin. J.W. followed her. She reached over the door for a shotgun. J.W. grabbed it and wrenched it away from her. "Listen to me, woman. This is hard times. We're taking this property, so don't make it worse than it is. We're who we are, and it ain't gonna change." Grace edged away. She picked the Bible up off the washstand and held it up. She was going into one of her religious states. "I know who you are. You're hired killers. The devil has a hold of you, and you've got no soul. But the devil cannot hurt me." J.W. looked up. "Well, I guess that's right, ma'am. The only soul I got is the one on the bottom of my boot, and I'm going to fit it up to your ass if you don't cooperate." J.W. turned around as Bob entered the doorway. The dog was attached to his chaps and growling. Bob kicked at the dog. "Damn, even their dogs are bushwhackers, Captain." Grace looked back at them. "I've got my Jesus. I've got the goodness of the Lord on my side." Bob turned kind of sour and mean as he looked in at Grace. Something from his past was cropping up. J.W. said, "Get the boys down, Bob, and let's load this stuff and get out of here." Bob was still struggling with the dog. J.W. said, "You know, I didn't have any trouble with that dog, Bob." Bob turned back out into the yard, the dog still attached to his chaps. He kicked at it. The Hess riders chuckled. Bob turned mean. Bob said, "Get down and pack the old lady up." Thurber said, "Why don't you shoot the damn dog, Bob?" "'Cause I don't shoot animals. I'd rather shoot lilac-smelling cowboys like you." The men got down, entered the house, and began to carry the furniture out.
Grace came outside and stood beside the door with her Bible in hand, preaching as they came in and out carrying her furniture. Does God twist justice? Would the Almighty pervert righteousness? Bob disappeared around the corner of the house, the dog still growling and attached to his shaft. There was a yelp. He came back around the corner without the dog. Grace was still preaching. Bud Grote came by carrying a clock. She got right in Bud's face. The murderer arises promptly at daylight because he may kill the poor and helpless. Another dog out at the barn continued to bark. And at nightfall, he turns a thief. Bob was getting angry on this note, and he transfixed on her. The adulterer's eye awaits twilight, and he says no one will see me, but then he puts a veil over his face. Bud Grote set the clock down in the yard. Bob reached out and grabbed Gracie and threw her out into the yard. She hit the clock and fell over it. J.W. exited the house and saw what was going on. He grabbed Bob from behind. He got him in a headlock under the arms. Bob was hung like a scarecrow. What the hell's the matter with you, Bob? She's just a damned old crazy woman. Bob remained tense as J.W. exerted more pressure. Let me go, J.W. My old stepmother used to thump that old Bible at me and beat me and my brother till we bled. That's how I got my lip cut. That ain't no reason to throw her things around the yard and shoot her. You're going to behave if I let go? Bob relaxed when J.W. let go of him. This ain't been your morning, Bob. You better go relieve the lookout and we'll finish up. You know, me and my brother killed my stepmother when we got old enough to run away. J.W. looked in Bob's face. Well, everybody's got something following around, Bob, and this ain't the place to have your friends dealing with it. The Hess Riders carried the last of the furniture out of the house. Bob mounted his horse and rode out of the yard as he'd been told to do. Grace was on the ground using one arm to support herself, still spouting scripture. There are those who rebel against his life. J.W. watched Bob go. He turned to Bud Grote beside him. Bud, go back inside and get that lantern off the washstand. What for, Captain? Bud asked. 'Cause I'm in a burn it, that's why. Oh, you can't burn a house, Captain. J.W. turned to Bud and faced him fair and square, reached out with the deed in his hand and took Bud by the shoulders. That's a war, Bud, with real bullets and sneaky raccoons behind trees. You burn a bushwhacker's house and he'll either run or he'll get mad and come out in the open. Part of every man's education, get it? Bud did as he was told. McDaniels followed him back into the house. It was full of blue smoke from the bacon burning on the stove. Bud got the lantern. He handed it to Captain McDaniels. McDaniels emptied the contents out on the kitchen floor. He lit a match and threw it into the oil. They walked back out into the yard. Herber handed them the reins to their horses and they mounted up. As they rode out of the yard, Grace was still on the ground quoting scripture. And at nightfall he turns thief. The adulterer's eye awaits twilight. He says no one will see me, but then he puts the veil over. The house burned behind Gracie, and J.W. remembered Elmer telling him about Atlanta. The governor's tour arrived precisely on time in Colby at noon. It carried the dignitaries for the governor's business tour. Holiday, Curtis, Danforth, the governor and his wife, R.D. Hess and his party, and the Reverend Farthingham from Topeka, a non-religious writer. They went to the Colby Hotel and had lunch. By 1:30, they were listening to Pennington of the Colby Gazette give an impassioned plea for the regional farmers and ranchers who had a beef against Kansas land policy and the Hesses. Pennington had an order style, and he spoke from the back of Zeke Hammett's wagon. So, my friends, the gift of liberty born up by our forefathers is our right.
the right to speak as free-born men for the right and rights of our children. Big doesn't mean good. As Brian pointed out on his cross of gold, the interests of big business in this country are always contrary to the rights of the common man. The Rockefellers in Colorado, the Wolf Creek Cattle Company in Kansas, it's all the same. Big business on the take. Eastern money out to steal from the small and honest. Governor, we've come here together to confront the dragon. No matter how rich or how callous you and these men are, you have to listen to the voice of the people. There was a murmur from the crowd. The governor held his hands up and said, Ad astra per astra. Cox from the Kansas City Star looked up at Pennington in the wagon and said, What'd he say? Pennington looked down. Well, to the stars forever. It's on the Kansas flag. I'm sorry, Cox replied. Guess I don't speak Latin. Pursuant to that, the governor replied to Pennington. He suggested that he, Holiday, Curtis, and Danforth would let the farmers and ranchers air their grievances against the Hesses and other big landowners. If it was in fact found that they were abusing access and water rights, then they would convene a grand jury in Leavenworth and take the necessary legal action against the landowners. Pennington and Peabody, the leader of the Farm and Ranch group, decided that this was at least a temporarily reasonable solution. Goodwill speeches and exchanges followed, and the crowd began to disperse. There was bunting in the banner on the side of the train that said the governor's business tour. Business is our business in Kansas. Hardy Hess was the only one that was not satisfied. Before 5, when the train pulled out, he had a short half-an-hour meeting with John Tacker and Langford. They expressed what they believed was the true situation. At the end of the meeting, R.D. rose, shook both men's hands, and made this statement. Well, gentlemen, it's painfully and embarrassingly obvious that the governor's not taking this matter seriously on our behalf. Langford, I love you. John, I have the utmost respect for you and J.W.'s abilities and judgment. You have my permission to do whatever is necessary to protect our interests here in Cheyenne County. Stay within the bounds of the law, that's all I ask. And I will protect you to the best of my ability. Gentlemen, God be with you and the best of luck. Langford, keep yourself safe. He hugged his son, walked down the steps of the hotel, boarded the train at 5:05, and it pulled out for Garden City. The late June rains had held the harvest up. From the 4th of July on, it turned off hot and dry. The work was hard. The Hess riders mourned the loss of Elmer and watched and waited for the 1st of August when they would go take the mill. It was the last day of July around 7:30 in the evening when the Hammett clan, along with Dick Richardson, who'd thrown in with them pursuant to the burning of Roy's house, arrived in Tom's yard. They entered the sod portion of the house. Tom and Roy were already there. They had the revolvers out on the table and were cleaning them. Tom was dipping the blunt-nosed .44-40 cartridges into a bottle of rat poison. All of the Hammets used .44-40 or .38-40 Winchesters that matched their Colt or Remington revolvers. Beck Lloyd was the only one that fired the old Army .45 cartridge. Tom put a box of .44-40 Remington shells on the table. That was to represent his father's house. To further show his plan, he used a salt shaker to represent the wash just north of the house, about 100 yards. Barkus and Peck Lloyd would rise early and walk the horses into the wash. The other men would walk over around 7. This would keep the dust down in case the Hesses had a spotter out. Tom concluded the meeting by saying, If they start up, we face them toe to toe, and nobody's ever going to say that the Hammets was cowards. Ramsey Joe turned to Landis. Where's Lottie, Landis? Well, I sent her over to Grandma's. The baby's got the croup. Well, you sent her into the battle zone, fool. When the meeting was concluded, Roy and Tom took their coffee outside and watched the sunset. Roy would leave around 7 in the morning for Zeke's place, help with the morning chores, and then eat breakfast. The plan was set. At the Wolf Creek Ranch, the Hess Riders finished dinner around the dining room table. J.W. had drawn a plan of the yard and exactly what was supposed to happen. Bud Grote had volunteered to go up the mill and tie the blade off to start the disassembly. Counting Bud, they would take 9 other men, all armed. J.W. carefully explained his contingency plan in the event that they were attacked. At the conclusion of the discussion, he turned to Langford. Langford, there's some things a man doesn't need to know, but I think you better know this, and you better remember it, because you may have to take it to the bank or your grave if that's the case. If they come in the yard and they look like they're going to start something, don't look them in the eye. That's Eastern dime novel stuff from fellows that have never faced anything more than a Kansas City steak. Watch your hands, because nobody ever killed anybody with their eyes. You understand? When they move that hand, you shoot them in the big part of their chest. That's the easiest. You understand? Yeah. Bob saw Dewy, excused himself from the table, went to the barn, got an oilcloth out, and disassembled the prize Winchester. He oiled it piece by piece as he put it back together with loving care. Bob wasn't a musical man, he was a military man, but he did hear tunes in his head. He was glad to be there with other men like him and a chance at the possibility of some military action. And it was August 1st of 1902. The sun was red and hot over the Kansas prairie. J.W. stepped onto the porch of the Wolf Creek Ranch. He had his jacket in one hand and a pistol with a piece of string and elastic tied to the trigger guard in the other. He had on a gray shirt and a $12 Stetson with a flat brim, the plainsman model made of beaver. He took the .41 Lightning into his hand, tied the elastic onto his shoulder. John Tacker helped him on with his coat, and the pistol went up his sleeve. Tacker wore a white shirt with green suspenders and the shoulder harness mounted over it that held the Mauser. He wore no coat, but he adjusted a jaunty campaign hat with a Rough Riders insignia on it. Langford was already mounted. His Savage rifle rested in the crook of his arm. He wore a $50 suit and a hat similar to J.W.'s but tan in color. Glenn Thurber was to drive the 6-up hitch with a lumber wagon, and Bud Grote would operate the brake. The other 7 riders were behind them, all mounted and armed with Winchesters bought at the hardware store. Bob was not present. He was scouting Zeke's place. J.W. walked to his horse and led it back to the porch in front of the men. All right, listen up. I didn't just fall off a turnip wagon while I was driving through town. What I say is the word of God, and your life may depend on it. So let's mount up. We're going to ride to the Wolf Creek Bridge. We're going to stop there and rest until we get a scout survey from Bob. J.W. mounted his horse and went to John. How's the eye? I can see through it. Pulls up on me, though, when I get it in the sun. You keep me to your left. That way I'll be in the center. I can shoot with the other eye. I've been practicing a little bit. The party rolled to the Wolf Creek Bridge. J.W. held his arm up. They dismounted and waited for Bob's scouting report. Bud Grote got down off the wagon, twirling a rabbit's foot on a leather thong. He came and stood with J.W., John, and Langford.
watched Bob emerge from the trees about 100 yards away and come to a place where he cut the barbed wire in the fence and crossed up onto the road and came towards them. J.W. asked for his scouting report. "What's the verdict, Bob?" "On a verdict, you should have got a judge, Captain. Here's the way I see it. Roy and Tom went into the house of the old lady about 20 minutes ago, maybe to eat or something. I think there's some horses in a wash about 150 yards north of the house. I can't say for sure how many, but I believe that they're there. Probably took them in there early this morning before I got there." J.W. turned around to the group. "All right, listen up. Here's the way of it. We're maybe going to have trouble and maybe not. You check those rifles and make sure there's no live loads under the hammer. They're just for show. If anything starts up, you let Bob and I and John handle it. You got it?" J.W. signaled the party to move. Bob looked at Bud Groat's rabbit's foot. "What's that?" "A lucky rabbit's foot, Mr. Sardu." Bob took the rabbit's foot. He walked about 5 feet to the bridge and threw it into the water. "What'd you do that for, Mr. Sardu?" Bob looked back at Bud. "Well, kid, if it was lucky, the rabbit would still have it, wouldn't he?" In the Hammett Ranch house, Roy and Zeke were seated at the table going over the sale records. Lottie was in the corner trying to mend some socks while she held the baby. Opal went to the screen door and looked out as the Hess Riders reached the fence line. The wire gate had been opened earlier that morning and they came on through, headed for the corrals toward the house. Langford and J.W. were in the lead. John Tacker and Bob Sardu rode on each side of the wagon. As they passed the corrals, Bob cut to his left and headed for the south side of the barn where he could take up a position seeing part of the yard and the wash. They stopped in front of the house. The party rolled to a halt. Zeke Hammett came out onto the porch. Roy was behind him. Zeke was dressed in his Sunday best. He reached in his vest and looked at his pocket watch. Langford spoke to him. "I'm L.D. Hess, Mr. Hammett. I have a signed bill of sale for that windmill." "Well, then turn your wagon around and take it down, then." Langford turned to Thurber and signaled him to turn the wagon. Thurber began a wide turn back into the yard. Roy went back into the house and put a duster on. J.W. noticed that the pockets were very heavy. He took note. John, Langford, and J.W. all dismounted. The Hammets walked with them towards the mill. About halfway to the water tank, Langford cut to the left, leading his horse to the adobe wall as he'd been instructed to do by J.W. When they reached the mill, Bud got down off the wagon, took a 12-foot coil of rope, and put his foot on the first rung of the ladder. Zeke gave him some advice. "You ought to take your spurs off, boy, before you go up the ladder." Bud didn't pay any attention and began the climb to the platform. In the wash behind the house, Tom scrambled back down the bank and confronted his kinsman. "All right, they're in the yard, and I think one of them's up on the mill. Now remember, we don't start anything unless they do. But by golly, if they do, then they're not going to say we were cowards. We'll let them have everything we got." Bud had reached the top of the mill. He uncoiled the rope and put it over the fan, and it creaked to a halt. In the wash, the Hammett men burst over the top of the lift and piled dust and horses. Bob raised his rifle and made a finger gesture, riders coming to J.W. J.W. looked up the mill and then back at Bob. Langford checked the breech of his Savage rifle. He was the only one that had a clear view of the approach. Bob would lose them as they passed behind the house. J.W. moved to his horse and removed his Africa double rifle and stood it against the tank. He shouted at Langford, "Get behind the wall, kid." Langford stood his ground beside his horse with his rifle ready and paid no attention. The hammocks burst around the side of the house and came to a halt in the yard in a cloud of dust. As they dismounted, Zeke turned to Roy. "I thought you said they was breaking horses." "I reckon they just come over to take the mill down, Dad." The hammocks began to dismount. Peck Lloyd was closest to Langford. Peck's gun hand was on Langford's blind side. J.W. stepped out in front of Roy and Zeke. John dropped behind them. The Mauser was in his hand and he held it by his side. J.W. opened his coat, showing that he had no gun. "Hey ho, boys, I think we got her handled." Some of the Hess riders began to retreat behind the lumber wagon. Thurber held the lead horses of the six-hitch team. Calder took the saddle horses and faded back into the field behind the mill. There was a point of a heartbeat, and then another. Bud let go of the rope that held the fan, and it creaked. Tom stepped forward so he was even with Peck Lloyd. Their gun hands were on Langford's blind side. Langford spoke to them. "Now one more step, that's far enough." He raised the Savage rifle and kept his eyes on their hands. "We got plenty of help, boys," J.W. shouted across the yard. Then he turned his head to Zeke. "I think it'd be the better part of good judgment if you'd ask him to leave, sir." There was another point of silence. For no known reason, Peck Lloyd's gun hand came up with a big .45 in it. He fired. A cloud of dust came off Bobby's head, a foot to Langford's left. The horse took the 250-grain .45 bullet underneath the eye. As Langford fell backwards against the adobe wall, he fired a shot. Peck Lloyd took a bullet from the .32 Special Savage in the chest and fell backwards, stiff as a board. His pistol discharged a second shot into the air. Tom had his pistol out. He watched Peck Lloyd settle into the dust. Tucker brought the Mauser up and pointed at the back of Zeke's head. "I got these two." Langford kicked the cans out of the way and cocked the Savage rifle. The case clanged into the milk cans. "That's enough! That's it!" J.W. shouted. He turned back to Zeke. "Call it off! Call it off now, Mr. Hammett. You tell him to stop." There was a pause on both sides. Ramsey Joe looked at Peck's dead body. "Son of a bitchin' rich boy." He brought his gun arm up, but Bob Sardu had anticipated this. He fired. The bullet struck Ramsey Joe on the right side and exited on the left, taking two of his ribs out. One of the pieces of bone hit Langford underneath the eye, and he thought he'd been shot. He turned and dived behind the adobe wall. J.W. flicked his arm, and the Colt came down the sleeve. Ramsey was turning in circles, firing another wild shot. J.W. took aim and shot him in the neck. He fell dead. "No, damn you," Ezekiel said. Ezekiel reached into his pocket, which contained a psalm book. John Tacker believed he was reaching for a gun, shot him once in the back and once in the side. He went down. Roy spun around to get even with John, a pistol coming up. He fired a shot. It hit right at John's feet. John jumped up in the air like a rabbit and shot Roy twice in the chest as Bob Sardu hit him with a .45-90. Roy was knocked 4 feet to his left and his head hit the water tank. He was a dead man. The Hammets, left alive, began to fire. J.W. grabbed his rifle, jumped over Roy's body, and hid behind the water tank. John stood out in the open, firing the rest of the Mauser cartridges at the Hammets. One of John's bullets struck Burchard in the leg, and he went down to one knee. One of Tom's shots passed over the tank and hit one of the horses in the 6-up team in the rump. Thurber let the horses go and dived behind the tank with J.W. A wild shot hit one of the fan blades up on the mill. Bud Goat knew it was time to jump. He did, and broke his ankle. Tom was firing behind Peck's dead body. Bob Sardu took a shot at him, and an enormous cloud of dust came up in front of Peck's body. Tom raised up, grabbed Peck's gun, and started through the yard and the milling horses toward the house. As he did, J.W. raced from behind the tank and fired 2 shots from the Colt. Both of them missed Tom, but one of them killed Birch, striking him square in the chest. Tom disappeared into the milling horses and dust. Dick Richardson had had enough. He'd emptied the .22 pistol and a Winchester. He was trying to find his footing in the stirrup of a horse as it headed for the corner of a house. J.W. shouted at Bob, "Got a runner coming out on the other side, Bob." Bob acknowledged. He got up and calmly walked to his horse and pulled the shooting fork. He sat down on the ground, planted the shooting fork in front of him, and put the barrel of the Winchester into the crotch. He picked up the 200-yard leaf sight and waited. Back in the yard, Landis made a run for it from behind a dead horse. He was headed for the house. Langford raised up from behind the adobe wall and fired. At the same time, John Tacker did. Landis's head twisted to the right and his hat flew off. He spit out teeth as he went down in a cloud of dust. Inside the house, Lottie Hammett had been watching the whole thing, holding the baby and standing at the window. "They shot Landis, Grandma." Opal came over to Lottie, grabbed her, and pushed her back underneath the dining room table. "Get under there, you bird brain." In the yard, John had killed Barkus with the last shot from the Mauser. Tom's guns were also empty. He spotted Birch's pistol by the edge of the house. He threw Peck Lloyd's .45 away and ran for Birch's gun, picking it up on the run and heading for the open barn doors. As he did, J.W. raised up and fired the huge Africa rifle. It missed, but the ball struck the barn and shook it. Tom dived into the barn underneath some harness rigging and was safe for a second. In the wash, Dick Richardson fumbled to get good stirrup footing. The horse scrambled to get up the bank. 180 yards behind him, Bob Sardu took careful aim, grinned a little, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet cut the air as it came in. It struck Dick Richardson just underneath the shoulder blade, and he tumbled back into the wash dead. Back in the yard, Opal Hammett came down the steps of the ranch house. She pulled a hatchet from a chopping block. She looked towards heaven and cried, "God Almighty, you murderers!" Then she began to cross the yard to where the water from the tank was mixing with Roy and Zeke's blood. John Tacker raised his pistol. J.W. deflected the barrel with the barrel of the Africa double rifle. "You'll want to be remembered for that, John." Langford raised up from behind the wall. "Tom's in the barn." "I seen him." Opal came across the yard and knelt down by Zeke's body in the mud. Tacker kept his eye on her, talking to J.W. "He said that mulatto woman down in Cuba wasn't dangerous either, and then she shot Corporal Billy's twanger off." Inside the barn, Tom had finished reloading the pistols. He could see Bob Sardu's shadow coming through the barn slats. Tom was not a man to give up. He raised up from the harness rigging, aimed a .44-40 at the shadows and fired. The bullet passed through the barn slats about 2 feet in front of Bob's face, cutting him with wood chips and dust. Bob dropped his Winchester and rolled away. Tom turned to the barn doors and sprinted outside. He was in the yard, headed for the house. Langford raised up and fired the rifle. A bullet skipped across the yard and hit Tom in the leg, knocking his leg out from under him. J.W. and John trained their guns on him, but they didn't fire. Tom was up like a game rabbit. He ran up the porch and dived through the screen door into the house. He put his back against the wall and chucked 2 empties out of the Remington and reloaded it. He stared across the room at Lottie. "I want you to go out in the yard and get me one of those horses. Do it now. I won't shoot a woman with a baby." Lottie stared at him. "I ain't doing nothing of the kind." Tom tore his pants open and looked at the bruise from the rifle bullet. He crawled across the room and dragged Lottie out from underneath the table. "Listen to me, woman. Landis ain't dead. He's still out there. If we don't get a horse and get him to the doctor, he'll probably die. McDaniels won't shoot a woman with a baby." He took her to the door, and they stood in the broken screen and looked out into the yard. He could see a horse that he wanted. "You get that horse and bring it around to the back door. Do it now." "I'm not going to." He pushed her out the door. Langford raised his rifle. Then he lowered it. Woman coming out, JW. JW surveyed the situation. He turned to Thurber. Go on, hitch that ass-shot horse and get Bud up. We're going to pull out. Do it, you hear me? Bob, you watch the back door. You hear me, Bob? Bob emerged from behind the barn with his Schofield in his hand and acknowledged that he did hear. Lottie held the baby and walked towards the sorrel horse with the reins down. She came to Landis. Landis opened his eye. His face was covered with blood, but he croaked out a few slurred words. Possum, don't let on. J.W. walked through the mud, past Opal, and into the yard. Through the dead horses and dead bodies, he shouted at Tom as he came, holding the double rifle in both hands at ready. Tom, you remember the story of that big bad wolf that huffed and puffed and blew your house down? Well, that's what's going to happen to you if you even think about shooting out that door or window. He reached Lottie. He reached down and picked up the reins from the sorrel horse that she'd been heading towards. That's a mighty nice baby, ma'am. Coochie coo, baby. What can I do for you? I need that horse. J.W. stared at her. Well, you go back in the house and you tell Tom to quit shooting at us and you can just have him. We're going to pull out. Now you do it, lady, or Landis there will probably bleed to death. You don't want the boys with me to know he's still alive after what your family tried on us. Now you go back in the house and tell him. Lottie backtracked toward the house with the baby. It was still crying. One of the Hammett dogs barked at J.W. as he began to back across the yard using the horse for cover. John and Langford held their guns on the house. J.W. arrived back at the tank. Opal was quoting scripture to herself on the ground. The water was still pouring out of the tank, making a big muddy mess. Thurber had unhitched the shot horse, put his pistol up, and killed it. Langford reached the tank. You're not going to leave him, are you, J.W.? I say we burn him out. J.W. cut Langford off. He was angry. You boys are hell in a fight, but I wouldn't give you $1 for all your brains assembled. We got our side of it and they got theirs. They started it and we finished it. It's that simple. We're right and they're wrong. As captain of this operation, that's my final say on the matter. Now pack it up. Thurber, get them horses hitched up. We're leaving. The other Hess riders had put Bud Grote in the back of the lumber wagon. J.W. walked over to him and looked in the bed. You all right, Bud? Bud looked up at Captain McDaniels. You got blood on your hat, Captain. J.W. took the hat off and inspected it. So I do, Bud. So I do. John handed J.W. his horse reins. He mounted up, holding the double rifle on his thigh, and the whole party pulled out for the gate. When they reached the gate, J.W. sent Langford on home with the rest of the crew, and they waited for Bob, covering his retreat from the corrals to the fence. When Bob reached J.W. and John, he spit the chin strap of the campaign hat out of his mouth, drew his beaded Indian bag, and started rolling a cigarette. He threw his knee up over the saddle horn. Don't mind me saying, Captain, but I don't think the law is going to smile on this. John, I'd appreciate it if you'd pay me when we get back to the Wolf Creek. I think I'm going to make for the territory. I can make Raton Pass in 3 days. John threw in his 2 bits worth. Should have killed Tom, J.W. It's a mistake. J.W. turned to John and Bob. Well, just as sure as the turning of the big world, there'll be another day. Come on, let's go home. The Hess riders turned and rode toward the 20th century. They faded down the fence line in the mirage of August heat. They were no less ghosts than the dead men that they left behind in the Hammett yard. The news of the battle reached Topeka. The governor called out the National Guard. 3 days later, the Hess riders gave themselves up on the Wolf Creek Ranch to an unarmed Sheriff McPhee. They were escorted by the guard back to St. Francis. J.W., John, and Langford were chained together and brought to the courthouse. They were indicted for conspiracy to commit murder. Bob Sardu collected $1,500 and a month's pay. He headed for the New Mexico Territory. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but it was never served. Bob later joined General Woods in the Mexican campaign. He served with honors at Columbus and Guerrero and died at the ripe old age of 83 in Fresno, California, in his wheelchair. When they went through his personal effects, they found a beaded tobacco bag. It had a human ear in it, probably taken in the Mexican campaign. Artie Hess, true to his word, hired Alexander Hessian, the leading defense attorney of the day. He paid him $60,000, win or lose. Tom Landis and the entire Hammett family maintained that the Hess Riders had fired first. Hessian introduced the extensive use of expert ballistics testimony to defeat the state's case against the Hess Riders. Hessian proved that the bullet that killed Langford's horse came from a .45 Colt, not the .44-40 or .38-40s carried by the Hammets. Peck Lloyd would have had to have been dead when he fired the shot from the .45 that killed Langford's horse. The Hess Riders were acquitted on February 19th of 1903. As they filed out of the courthouse, John Tacker made a comment to Tom. He swore that he'd see him someday again. Langford made a statement to the press that although what they did was not wrong, it would weigh heavily on their conscience. Landis Hammett eventually regained his speech pursuant to the throat wound and moved to Utah and became a successful citrus farmer. Tom Hammett went back to work on the family ranch until he lost it in a card game in 1914. He moved to Nebraska and changed his name to Hammond and went to work for the railroad. Lottie and Opal sued the Wolf Creek Ranch Corporation for wrongful death in civil court and were eventually awarded $20,000. The judge suggested that McDaniels and Tacker leave the state. They left the U.S. and started a cigar export company in Cuba. It was privately known that John Tacker swore vengeance against Tom for the eventual loss of his eyesight in his right eye and the false charges. They were never seen again in the U.S. Tom Hammett was shot down by persons or person unknown in Beatrice, Nebraska in 1922. No charges were ever filed for lack of evidence as to who was responsible. Langford Hess became a highly successful international businessman. He married Alicia Farthingham, daughter of the Reverend Farthingham, in 1904 in Topeka. He was respected and loved by his employees and most all of the people who knew him. He served as a major in World War I. He ran for governor of Kansas in 1922 and was narrowly defeated by 1,800 votes. R.L. Cox of the Kansas City Star probably put it the best when he said, Langford Hess was brought down by his associations with villainous company.
You have been listening to Kansas Bad, adapted from the original book and screenplay by Marc Miles. The author wishes to thank Eileen Charbo for her research at the Kansas State Historical Society, Sally Jackson for story editing, and supervising producer Kurt Mueller. Cover art by Phil Daves, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Music by Doug Montgomery at the piano. Marc Miles and Bobby Notkoff on violin. This story is dedicated to the memory of S.I. Miles, John Lowver, and Harry Metz, who grew up in the last days of the American frontier. This program is a Sunset Production presentation, produced and recorded in Santa Fe, New Mexico, copyright 1991, all rights reserved. Look for other audiobooks by Marc Miles. The Fisherman, a tale of murder and Arab intrigue in Los Angeles. The Verdigris Man, a Western horror story based on a legend of the Southwest. Thank you for listening to our presentation. This is Gil Hodges.